I wasn't supposed to be there for long, just 3 nights, maybe 4 if I liked it. I booked the place because I needed to disconnect for a bit. I'd been working too much, staring at screens every day, my eyes hurting, my back stiff, and my sleep messed up. The cabin looked perfect in the photos. Quiet, small, nothing fancy, just a wooden building in the middle of the woods beside a lake. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, just trees, water, and quiet. It was late September, and most of the tourists had already left the area. That's part of why I picked that week. I didn't want to bump into anyone. I brought some basic supplies: canned food, pasta, rice, oatmeal, instant coffee, a flashlight, a camp stove even though the cabin had one, batteries, a first aid kit, and my old hunting knife. I wasn't planning to hunt. I just felt better having it with me. I also brought a small cooler with some fresh stuff: eggs, cheese, butter. I figured I'd fish a little if the weather was okay. The drive was long, almost 8 hours from my place to the lake. I arrived just before sunset. There was a narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, surrounded by thick pine forest. The road hadn't been maintained in a while. It was full of potholes and small rocks, and my car bounced more than I liked. Branches scratched the sides of my car, and I could hear the gravel shifting under my tires. When I finally got there, I killed the engine and stepped out. The air smelled different, cleaner. I stood there for a minute, just breathing. I could hear birds, wind through the trees, and the faint sound of water lapping against the shore. No cars, no people, no noise. It was almost too quiet. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Maybe 20 feet long, 15 feet wide. The porch was uneven, with 3 steps that creaked badly. The door stuck a little when I opened it. Inside, it was simple: a wood stove in the corner, a tiny kitchen area with a sink and old cabinets, a small table with 2 chairs, a twin bed against the wall, and a dusty bookshelf full of yellowing paperbacks. There was no bathroom inside, just an old outhouse about 20 feet behind the cabin. I unpacked quickly, threw my sleeping bag on the bed, set up my cooler and food on the counter, and filled a metal jug from the outdoor pump. The water was cold and smelled a little metallic, but it was clear. I lit a few candles and sat down on the porch as the sun dropped behind the trees. The lake turned dark blue, almost black. Mist rose off the surface. I didn't stay out long. I went inside and locked the door. I didn't know why I locked it. I was alone out there, but it made me feel better. That first night, I didn't sleep well. The woods are loud in a different way than cities. It's not constant noise. It's random and sharp. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, branches creaking. Every sound made me sit up. I kept looking out the window, trying to spot animals. Once I thought I saw a shape near the tree-line, but it could have been anything. A raccoon, a deer, even just shadows playing tricks. I woke up groggy the next morning and made oatmeal on the stove. I ate it standing on the porch, staring at the lake. It looked peaceful. The trees around it reflected off the surface. I decided to take a walk. I followed a trail that wrapped around the lake. It was overgrown in some spots. I found animal tracks in the mud. Deer mostly, maybe some foxes. I didn't see any people or even signs of people. No litter, no footprints, nothing. When I got back, I sat on the edge of the dock that extended about 10 feet into the lake. The wood was soft and green from years of moisture. I pulled out a small rod I brought and tried fishing for a bit, but I didn't catch anything. I didn't really care. I just wanted to sit there, legs dangling over the water, letting time pass. That night was colder. I lit a fire in the wood stove and boiled some pasta. I read one of the old paperbacks, something about a man trapped in a snowstorm. The wind picked up around midnight. I could hear it hitting the walls, howling through the gaps in the boards. I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, listening. The third day is when I noticed something strange. I found boot prints near the edge of the trail behind the cabin. Not fresh, but not old either. Heavy treads. Not mine. I wore hiking shoes with a different pattern. These looked like thick work boots. At first, I figured someone else had passed through, maybe before I got there. But I hadn't seen any tracks the day before, and it hadn't rained. Later that day, I walked farther along the trail, a few miles out. I saw more prints. Same ones. I followed them for a bit, but they eventually turned off into the brush. I stopped following. I didn't want to get lost. Still, I felt uneasy. I told myself maybe it was an old hunter or someone who lived nearby, even though the listing said it was remote and unoccupied. That night, I locked the door again. I even pushed the little table in front of it. I stayed up staring at the windows. I didn't light candles. I didn't want light leaking out. I kept the fire low. I didn't know what I was scared of exactly. It was just a feeling, a tightness in my stomach, like something wasn't right. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was soft at first, a single crunch like a foot on dry leaves. Then silence. Then another, closer. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight, turned it off before I even aimed it. I didn't want to shine it out there. I moved slowly toward the window. The glass was fogged up, but I could see movement, just a shape, not clear. It stood near the tree-line, maybe 15 feet from the cabin. Still, I didn't breathe. I just stood there, heart pounding. It didn't move. After what felt like an hour, it turned and disappeared back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the knife in my hand, just sitting on the edge of the bed, ears straining for sound. I wanted to leave in the morning, but I felt stupid. What would I say? I saw a shadow? Heard footsteps? Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I imagined it. I stepped outside just after sunrise. The ground was wet from dew. I walked to where I thought the figure had been. There were footprints, fresh, deep, same boot tread as before, but more of them now. They circled the cabin. They stopped at the porch steps, then turned and walked back toward the woods. I packed my things. I didn't want to stay, but when I tried to start my car, the engine made a grinding sound and died. I tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood. I don't know much about engines, but even I could tell something was wrong. The battery cable had been cut. Clean, like with a blade. That's when the fear really kicked in. Someone had been there, close, watching me, close enough to disable my car. I stood there for a long time, staring into the woods, heart racing. I felt exposed. I grabbed my knife and took everything back inside. Pushed the table against the door again. Nailed a few old boards I found across the window frames. The sun moved slow that day. I didn't eat much, just sat by the door with the knife and flashlight. When the sun went down, I didn't light anything. No fire, no candles. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark, listening. Hours passed. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, slower, more careful. I didn't move, just held the knife tighter. The steps circled the cabin. Then I heard the porch creak. The doorknob turned slowly, rattled, pushed, but the table held. Then came scratching, light at first, then harder, like someone dragging a nail or a knife across the wood. I waited, frozen. My throat was dry. I wanted to yell but didn't. Stopped after a while. I stayed awake till sunrise. In the morning, I checked the door. Deep grooves had been scratched into the wood. Someone wanted in. They knew I was inside. They wanted me to know. I didn't know what to do. I was miles from town. No car. No phone signal. I thought about hiking out, but I didn't know which way to go. If I took the road, I'd be exposed the whole time. If I took the woods, I could get lost or followed. I stayed one more night. I didn't sleep. I held the knife till my hand cramped. No steps that night, just silence. That scared me more. In the morning, I packed a small bag. Took water, a few snacks, the knife, and a flashlight. I left everything else. I didn't care. I just wanted out. I followed the dirt road, fast, looking over my shoulder every minute. After about 5 miles, I saw a truck parked in the woods just off the road. Old, rusted, covered in pine needles, tarp in the back. It looked like it had been there for a while, but the tires were clean. That meant it had moved recently. I didn't stop. I walked faster. My legs were sore, my shoulders ached, but I kept going. After hours, I saw a mailbox, then a farmhouse. I ran up the driveway, and the woman who lived there nearly screamed when she saw me. I must have looked like hell. Dirt on my face. It started with a plan to get away. I had been working too much, not sleeping right, barely seeing daylight. My doctor told me to take time off, and I didn't argue. I figured I'd rent a cabin up north, somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the city noise, traffic, and constant buzz. I didn't want to see anyone. No phone calls, no emails, no people. Just quiet. I found a small cabin listed online. It wasn't part of a resort or campground. It was a private rental sitting in the woods, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The listing said it had running water, electricity, a fireplace, and a small generator for backup. There were a few photos, nothing fancy, but it looked clean and isolated. That's all I wanted. I booked it for 2 weeks and packed everything I thought I'd need. Dry food, water jugs, warm clothes, flashlights, batteries, a hunting knife, and my old hiking boots. I drove up on a Sunday morning. The weather was dry, cool, and the skies were overcast. The road to the cabin turned to gravel about 10 miles out, then narrowed until it was barely wide enough for my truck. Tall pines lined both sides, branches hanging over like a tunnel. I didn't pass another car the entire time. I didn't see a single person. I reached the cabin around noon. It was smaller than I expected. One floor, one main room with a bed in the corner, a small kitchen, a table, and a couple chairs. There was a bathroom with a composting toilet and a small sink hooked up to a water barrel outside. It was dead quiet out there. No wind, no birds, just stillness. Felt like time had stopped. I unpacked and walked around the property. The nearest neighbor was probably miles away. The trees were thick, and the cabin sat in a small clearing. Behind it, the forest sloped gently down toward a shallow creek. I followed a deer trail down to the water, checked it out, then came back and lit a fire in the pit outside. The first few days were peaceful. I woke with the sun, made coffee on the old propane stove, went for walks in the woods, read books, wrote in a notebook, and sat by the fire at night. No phone service, no internet. It was exactly what I needed. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything besides the occasional rustle of leaves and the snapping of twigs. On the fourth day, I started feeling watched. It was small at first, like a prickling on the back of my neck when I walked into the woods. I brushed it off. I figured I'd just been alone too long. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, I woke up to a noise. It sounded like footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching leaves. I lay still in the dark, holding my breath. I didn't move for a long time. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a person. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed and turned it on. I didn't see anything through the window. I opened the door and shone the light outside. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The sound had stopped. The next day, I found footprints near the fire pit. They were faint but there. Not boot prints like mine. They looked like old running shoes. Whoever made them hadn't come from the trail. They came from the woods behind the cabin. I felt cold all over. I walked the whole property twice that day, checking the tree line, calling out even though I didn't expect an answer. Nothing. That night, I locked the cabin door, even though I hadn't done that before. I kept the flashlight in my hand while I lay in bed. I left a kitchen knife beside me. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found a small pile of stones stacked on the porch. 5 smooth stones balanced carefully. I hadn't put them there. I hadn't even seen stones like those around the property. My stomach turned. I knocked them over and looked around the clearing, but again, saw nothing. No sounds, no signs of anyone. The woods were too quiet. I decided to cut my trip short. I packed most of my gear into the truck and planned to leave at first light the next day. I didn't want to drive the gravel road in the dark. I spent that day on edge, barely eating, barely moving from the cabin. Every noise made me jump. I kept checking the windows. I kept checking the lock. That night was the worst. I woke up to the sound of the back door creaking. Not the front one, the back, the one near the kitchen. I hadn't even thought to check if it locked, because it was warped and barely fit the frame. My heart started racing. I grabbed the flashlight and the knife and crept out of bed. I turned the light on. The door was cracked open. There were muddy footprints on the floor, bare feet, long toes, narrow heels. Not animal prints. Human. I scanned the room, but no one was there. The bathroom door was open. The front door was locked. The window above the kitchen sink was closed. I backed into the corner, clutching the knife and shaking. I stayed there for 2 hours. When the sun finally started to rise, I rushed outside, knife still in hand. I ran to the truck, threw open the door, and saw that the gas cap was missing. It was lying on the ground a few feet away. There was something thick and sludgy poured into the tank. I could smell it, motor oil maybe. My keys still worked, but the truck wouldn't start. I tried 3 times. Nothing. The engine clicked and died. I sat in the cab, feeling trapped. There was no cell signal. No one knew I was up there. I hadn't told anyone the exact location. I had no way to call for help. I stayed in the truck until full daylight. I kept looking at the woods, waiting for someone to come out. No one did. I finally got out and walked back into the cabin, locked the doors, and started going through my supplies. I had food and water for maybe a week if I rationed it, but I didn't plan on staying. I took my backpack, packed food, water, and 1 flashlight. I took the knife and a second smaller one I kept in my bag. I put on my hiking boots and checked the map I'd brought. There was a logging road about 7 miles to the east. If I could reach it, I could flag down a truck or find help. I left the cabin at noon, locking the door behind me even though it felt useless. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear birds or squirrels, just wind and my own footsteps. I kept moving, checking the map every mile. I tried to move fast, but the terrain slowed me down. Thick underbrush, fallen logs, uneven ground. I had to backtrack more than once. Around 4 p.m., I realized I was being followed. At first, I thought I imagined it. Then I heard branches breaking behind me, always a few seconds after I moved. I stopped and it stopped. I started again and it did too. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who or what it was. I changed direction, heading slightly south to throw it off. The sound stopped for a while. I kept going until I found a small ridge with a view down into a clearing. I crouched and waited. After 5 minutes, I saw movement. A person walked into the clearing. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes, face partly covered with what looked like a hood or mask. They didn't look around. They just stood there for a while. Then they crouched and started placing stones in a small stack. I moved again. I didn't stop. It was nearly dark when I reached the logging road. I had no flashlight left. Both batteries were dying. I waited by the side, hoping a truck would come. Nothing came for hours. I walked. Around midnight, I saw headlights. Pickup truck slowed when they saw me, and I waved both arms. The man driving rolled down his window. I didn't even explain, I just asked for help. He drove me to a ranger station 20 miles out. I told them everything. They sent a couple guys back to the cabin the next morning. They found the door wide open. My gear was gone. All of it. They found more footprints around the cabin, multiple sets. Different sizes. They never caught anyone. Never found any signs beyond that. The truck had been vandalized beyond repair. Oil, sand, and something else poured into the tank. I had to pay to get it towed back to town. I never went back to that area again. Sometimes, I still wake up in the night thinking I hear someone walking outside. When that happens, I get up, check every door and window, and sit in the dark with a flashlight in my hand. I never figured out who it was. I don't want to, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there. Not even close. I don't usually take solo trips anymore. Not after what happened in October of 2021. I'd always liked being alone, away from people, just with nature and quiet. I worked a boring office job at the time, sitting at a desk all day and typing the same numbers into spreadsheets. I needed breaks from that world. Sometimes I went hiking. Other times, I booked small cabins deep in the woods, places with no phone signal and no neighbors. That October, I found one like that. It was a small wooden cabin listed on a local rental site. It wasn't on Airbnb or any of the big ones. It looked like someone built it themselves and only rented it out sometimes. There were only a few pictures, but the one that got me was of the back porch. It looked out over a huge stretch of forest that seemed untouched. Just trees. No fences, no other buildings. Nothing but green. I booked it for a full week. The drive took longer than I thought. My GPS gave up once I left the main road, and I had to follow printed directions from the listing. I passed maybe 2 houses after the pavement turned to gravel. Then it was just dirt roads and woods. The road narrowed to the point I wasn't sure my car would fit between the trees. But I kept going, and after what felt like forever, I saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees on all sides. It looked even smaller than I thought it would. Just one floor, a single door, and a couple of dusty windows. The porch out back faced a steep hill that dropped into a valley full of dense trees. The quiet hit me right away. No wind, no birds, no insects, just stillness. Inside, it was simple. One room with a bed, a small table, a kitchenette, and a bathroom in the corner. No TV, no internet, just a few books on a shelf and a couple of old maps pinned to the wall. There was a wood stove for heat and an electric lantern on the table. I had brought enough food, water, and gear to last the week. I felt good about it. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, made some simple food, sat on the porch and read. I walked a little near the cabin but didn't want to go too far that first evening. As the sun dropped, the woods turned dark fast. I had to remind myself that I came out here because it was isolated. That night, I slept easily. The second day, I explored. There was no path behind the cabin, but the ground wasn't too rough. I went down the hill and into the woods. I brought a compass and marked trees with orange ribbon just in case. The forest was dense but quiet. Too quiet. I started to notice it more then, how there were no bird sounds, no rustling. Even my steps seemed too loud. About a mile in, I found an old fence. It was falling apart and mostly hidden under brush. Looked like it had been built decades ago. It didn't make sense to me why there'd be a fence out here, this far from anything. I followed it for a bit, but didn't see any buildings or animals. Eventually, I turned back. When I got to the cabin, it was still dead silent around me. Not a single bird. That night, something changed. I woke up around 3 a.m. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was pitch dark. I didn't hear anything, but something felt wrong. My skin prickled. I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing, not even wind outside. I tried to go back to sleep but kept opening my eyes again. Sure, I had heard something, a branch snapping, footsteps maybe, but every time I sat up and listened, there was nothing. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. Day 3, I stayed near the cabin. I told myself I was just tired, but I kept glancing at the woods. I kept thinking someone was out there, maybe some hunter or squatter. I walked around the cabin, checked the trees nearby. I even looked for footprints in the dirt but didn't find any. Still, I had this strong feeling that someone had come close the night before, like I wasn't alone. That evening, I cooked an early dinner and locked the door before dark. I sat on the bed with a book, the lantern casting yellow light on the wood walls. Around 10 p.m., I heard it again. A light tap, then another, like something brushing against the outside of the cabin. I turned off the lantern and sat still. The sound stopped. I got up and went to the window slowly. I couldn't see anything, just blackness, no moonlight. I stared out for a while, thinking I might catch movement. Nothing. I waited another hour, then finally tried to sleep. I left the lantern on. At 2:40 a.m., I woke again. This time, I knew what woke me. The doorknob turned. I heard it clearly, a metal click and the soft squeak of movement. Then stillness. I stared at the door from the bed. I didn't breathe. My chest felt tight. It didn't turn all the way, but it definitely moved, like someone tested it, then stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I got up and checked the door. It was locked. No marks, no scratches. I opened it slowly with a flashlight in hand. Just trees. I stepped outside and shined the light around. Nothing. But that feeling was back, worse than before. Like eyes on me, I backed into the cabin and locked up again. The fourth day, I packed up. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I knew I had to go. It wasn't just the noise. It was the silence during the day. The air felt heavy. I felt watched constantly. I couldn't relax or think straight. I loaded my gear, grabbed trash, and tried to leave before dark. But my car wouldn't start. I tried everything. Checked the battery, looked for loose wires. It didn't make sense. It had started fine all week. Now it didn't even turn over. No lights, no sounds. Completely dead. I opened the hood again, looked around. Then I noticed something. The cable to the battery had been cut. Clean cut. Not frayed. Not chewed. It was sliced. I stood there, staring at it. My breath felt stuck in my throat. Someone had been under the hood. Someone had done this while I slept or while I was inside. I went back inside and locked the door. My hands were shaking. I still had 4 days left on the rental. No phone signal. No car. I couldn't walk out until I was sure I knew the way, and I didn't want to risk it getting dark while I was out there. So I stayed. I blocked the door with the table. I kept the lantern and a knife near the bed. I didn't sleep. That night, I heard the footsteps. Not far off. Right outside. Slow. Heavy. One at a time. Crunching leaves. Then silence. Then again closer. I didn't look. I didn't move. I sat in bed with my back against the wall, staring at the door. The knob didn't move again, but I knew someone was out there. I knew they were waiting. The fifth day, I stayed inside all day. I watched through the windows. I thought about trying to hike out, but I didn't trust the forest. I didn't trust the silence. I waited. That night, I didn't hear footsteps, but I found something worse. In the morning, I opened the door slowly to look around. On the porch, placed carefully, was a small dead bird. Its neck was broken. It had been placed neatly in the center of the porch mat. There were no tracks, no blood, just the bird. I backed inside and locked the door. I didn't eat that day. I didn't drink much water either. My throat was dry, but I felt like I was going to throw up constantly. My head hurt. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Day 6, I tried to fix the car. I took apart part of the cable and tried to reattach it with some wire I found in a toolbox in the cabin. I don't know much about cars, but I had to try something. It didn't work. Nothing turned on. I slammed the hood shut and sat on the ground next to the car. I cried for the first time in years. I decided I was going to leave on foot the next morning, no matter what. That night, the worst thing happened. Around midnight, I was in bed, trying to stay calm, when I heard something new, a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt. Then a knock, not on the door, on the wall, the back wall, the one that faced the hill. Then again, a knock, then another, then silence. I stayed frozen. I waited until sunrise before I moved. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed some water bottles, a flashlight, and food into it, and left. I didn't look back. I used my compass and followed the same direction I had come in on the first day. I walked fast. I didn't stop for anything. It took me almost 7 hours to reach a road. When I saw it, I dropped to my knees. I waved down a car, and the man inside let me use his phone. He didn't ask questions. I didn't give answers. Later, when I told police, they said they'd look into it. But nothing came of it. The owner of the cabin said no one had ever reported anything strange. No cameras, no footprints, no proof. Just me looking paranoid. Maybe I was, but I know what I heard, what I saw, that bird, that wire, those footsteps. Someone had been out there. Someone had waited until I was far from help. I never went back. I quit my job not long after and moved closer to family. I don't usually tell people about that trip. It's not because I'm scared anymore. It's because most people don't believe me. There's no wild twist, no supernatural stuff, and no creepy legends behind it. It's just something that happened, something that changed how I see isolation, how I think about safety, and how I understand what people are really capable of. This happened back in 2019. I was living in Minnesota, working long hours in IT support at a university. Burnout was creeping in. I'd started having trouble sleeping, staying focused, and even holding simple conversations. I didn't want to quit my job, but I knew I needed a break. I had some paid time off saved up and decided to use it all at once. I figured a week in the woods would help me reset. Just me, some books, a journal, and nothing but quiet. I found a cabin on a small rental website. It wasn't listed on the big ones like Airbnb, but it looked real enough. The photos were decent. Nothing fancy, just a plain wooden cabin tucked deep into the Superior National Forest. The owner said it was completely off-grid. No cell service, no internet, no electricity, but it had a working wood stove, solar-powered lights, a well pump for water, and a propane-powered mini-fridge. That was enough for me. It was exactly the kind of escape I was looking for. I packed my truck with supplies: canned food, dry goods, a first aid kit, a flashlight, batteries, a hunting knife, a hatchet, and some paperback novels. I also brought a small solar panel charger for emergencies. I printed out directions because I knew my phone GPS wouldn't work once I was far enough north. The drive took about 6 hours. I left early in the morning and reached the forest trailhead by late afternoon. From there, I had to follow a narrow dirt road that was barely wide enough for my truck. The road twisted through dense woods, climbing gradually. There were no signs, no markers, just the faint tire ruts that showed other people had used it before. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the cabin. The cabin itself was small. One room, a twin bed with an old but clean mattress, a small table and 2 chairs, a counter with a gas stove and the mini fridge, some shelves with old kitchenware, matches, candles, and basic tools. The bathroom was just an outhouse about 30 feet out back. There was also a wood pile beside the cabin and an axe leaning against it. It was quiet, not just regular quiet. It was the kind of silence that made your ears ring. No cars, no voices, just the occasional bird call and the wind moving through the pines. That first evening, I made a simple dinner, rice and beans cooked over the gas stove. I unpacked my things, made the bed, and sat outside for a while, watching the sun go down. The stars came out fast, brighter than I'd seen in years. It felt peaceful, like I'd finally found the reset button. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted. I woke up early, went on long walks along old logging trails, read my books by the window, and wrote in my journal. I didn't hear or see a single person. Felt like I had the entire forest to myself. But things started to change on the 3rd night. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't normal forest noise either. It was a sharp cracking sound, like someone stepping on a branch just outside the cabin. I sat up in bed and held still, listening. A few seconds passed. Then another snap, closer this time. I got out of bed and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't turn it on right away. I moved slowly to the window and looked out. I couldn't see anything. It was too dark. I stood there, barely breathing. Then I heard it again. This time it was even closer, right outside the cabin wall. I turned on the flashlight and shined it out the window. Still nothing. I couldn't see any movement, no animals. But the noise stopped. I stood there for a few more minutes. Then I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do the first 2 nights, and went back to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything odd. No footprints, no damage, no signs of animals digging through my food. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. Still, I kept the knife on the table beside the bed that night. That evening, I went for a short walk before sunset. I didn't go far, maybe a half-mile out and back. When I returned, something felt different. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like someone had been in the cabin while I was gone. Nothing was missing. Nothing was obviously out of place. But there was a faint smell, not bad, just not mine, like old cologne or stale sweat. I opened the windows to let it out. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up at the smallest sounds. Once, I thought I heard a soft thump on the porch, like a boot hitting wood. I turned on the flashlight and stared at the door for what felt like an hour. But nothing happened. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach sink. There were boot prints on the porch. Not mine. They were slightly larger than mine with a different tread pattern. I followed them a few feet into the dirt, but they disappeared into the pine needles. I started thinking about leaving, but the idea of packing up and driving back through those woods alone, especially knowing someone might be out there, made me nervous. I told myself I'd stay one more night and leave early the next morning. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go on my usual walk. I kept my knife on me the whole time. I tried to read, but couldn't focus. Every time the wind moved the trees or a squirrel rustled in the brush, I jumped. That night, just after sunset, I heard the sound again. Footsteps. This time, it wasn't just a few cracks. It was steady, slow, deliberate steps moving around the cabin. I turned off all the lights and sat in the corner with the knife. I held my breath and listened. Whoever it was circled the cabin. I heard them walk up onto the porch. Then silence. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of the door handle being tested. Not hard, just a slow turn. The door was locked, but they kept testing it, gently turning it back and forth. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting. Eventually, the handle stopped. More silence. Then the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat there, waiting for morning. When the first light came through the trees, I packed everything fast. I loaded the truck in minutes and didn't even bother with breakfast. I drove as fast as I could down that dirt road, gripping the steering wheel tight, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I would say. There was no crime, just footprints, just fear. I didn't even know who the cabin owner really was. I never booked through that site again. I got back home that afternoon. I locked my apartment door for the first time in months and took the knife from my bag and put it on my nightstand. A few weeks later, I read a local news story online. A man had been arrested for stalking and trespassing. He'd been living in an old hunting shack about 10 miles from the cabin. Apparently, he'd been off-grid for years, coming and going through the forest, watching hikers and campers without them knowing. He had journals full of notes about people he'd watched, places he'd been. Some of the notes matched the area I'd stayed in. They never said his name and no photos were released. Just that he'd been caught after trying to break into a seasonal cabin while the owners were there. I don't know if it was the same guy. I never told anyone what happened. I just stopped camping alone. I still spend time in the woods, but always with friends, always in busier places. That trip taught me something important. Sometimes the scariest things out there aren't monsters or ghosts. They're just people. People who don't want to be found. People who live by their own rules. People who watch from the shadows while you sleep. And I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of those footsteps outside the cabin, slow and steady, getting closer in the dark. It was early November when I decided to take a break from everything. My job was draining me, and the city noise was starting to mess with my sleep. I didn't tell anyone much about where I was going. I just told a couple of coworkers I'd be off-grid for a while and then drove out of town. I had booked a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains. It was about 4 hours from where I lived, and from the pictures online, it looked peaceful. There was no cell service there, no Wi-Fi. That was the point. The road to the cabin was narrow and curved along the hills. After passing the last town, I didn't see another car for nearly an hour. The road turned to gravel, and then it was just dirt. I followed the directions that were emailed to me by the owner. After another 30 minutes through woods with barely enough room for my car between the trees, I found the place. The cabin was small, a single-story structure with a wooden porch and a tin roof. The forest surrounded it tightly, like it had been dropped right in the middle of nowhere. There was a fire pit in the back, some stacked firewood on the side, and a small shed off to the left. It had electricity, but everything else was rustic. The water came from a well. The heat came from a wood stove. I settled in the first evening, made some tea, unpacked my stuff, and set up a sleeping bag on the couch. I didn't bother with the bed in the back room. I liked being close to the stove. The wind had picked up that night. It howled through the trees and whistled through tiny cracks in the wood walls. I sat there for a while just listening to it and letting myself slowly relax for the first time in weeks. By the third day, I had adjusted to the rhythm. I spent my time hiking the trails nearby, reading by the fire, and cooking simple meals. I didn't think much of anything except the present moment. That was until I noticed something strange in the woods. It was late in the afternoon. I had just returned from a short hike to a nearby stream and was walking back up the hill toward the cabin. That's when I saw the tree. The tree itself wasn't strange. It was tall, with thick bark and a slight lean to the right. But there was something tied to its trunk. A bundle of sticks, twisted and bound tightly with old string. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. I passed that tree twice earlier that day and nothing was tied to it. I went closer to look. The bundle looked like some kind of symbol, like a triangle with a loop at the top. The string was old and frayed, but the knot was tight. I didn't touch it. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I backed away and walked back to the cabin without turning around. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The wind had stopped, and everything was too quiet. I kept hearing what I thought were footsteps outside. They were slow and spaced out, like someone was walking in circles around the cabin. I got up once and peeked out the window, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the porch. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer, maybe raccoons, but deep down I didn't believe that. The next morning, I went outside to look for tracks. The ground was damp from dew. I expected to see maybe some animal prints, but what I saw instead were boot prints. Human, clear as day. They circled the cabin twice, stopped by the shed, then walked off into the woods. I tried not to panic. Maybe it was the cabin owner checking in, but they said in the email they wouldn't be up for weeks. There was no phone signal to ask anyone. I decided not to let it get to me. I brought some wood inside, locked the doors, and stayed in the rest of the day. The next night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a soft thud. Came from the back room. I sat up quickly, heart pounding, and listened. Another thud, then silence. I didn't have a weapon, but I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the door. I pushed it open slowly. The back room was empty. Nothing was out of place. But the window, which I remembered locking the day I arrived, was slightly open. Just enough that someone could slide a hand in. Or maybe even more. I slammed it shut and nailed it with a few pieces of firewood, then dragged a chair under the handle. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Just sat by the stove, poker in my lap, and waited for the sun. The next morning, I wanted to leave. I started packing up my stuff, tossing it into my bag, and loaded the car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. It made a grinding noise, then nothing. I tried again, still nothing. I popped the hood. I wasn't a mechanic, but I could see the battery cables were cut. That's when I knew someone didn't want me leaving. I stood there for a long time trying to stay calm. My heart was racing, and I felt like I could barely breathe. I looked around. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I decided to walk. The nearest town was about 9 miles down the dirt road. I packed water, some granola bars, a flashlight, and my knife. I locked the cabin behind me, not that it would stop anyone, and started walking. The walk was long and slow. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. After about 3 hours, I reached the old dirt road. I kept walking until I saw the creek that ran parallel to the road, which meant I was getting closer to the small service station near the junction. But when I got to the bridge over the creek, I stopped. Someone had dragged a pile of logs and branches across it. It looked like it was meant to block a vehicle, not a person, but still. It was the intention that scared me. I climbed over it and kept going. Another hour later, I reached the gas station. The man there let me use the phone. I called a tow truck and the sheriff. When they went back with me, the cabin had been broken into. The door was open. My bags were slashed. My food was gone. The chair was flipped. The window in the back room was broken. They searched the area but found no one. No signs of a vehicle, no other tracks. Just mine. The sheriff asked if I had enemies, if I was being followed. I said no. I didn't know what else to say. They let me ride back to town with them. I stayed in a motel that night. Couldn't sleep. Weeks passed. I didn't go back to the city right away. I stayed with a cousin in the suburbs, tried to relax. But my thoughts kept going back to the woods, to the symbol on the tree, the cut battery cables, the footsteps around the cabin, the thud in the night. I never found out who did it or why. The cabin owner refunded me and said they'd never had a problem before, but they also said no one else had rented it after me. I don't think they wanted to deal with whatever was going on either. I don't go on solo trips anymore. I still like the idea of getting away, but now I make sure there's phone signal. I let people know exactly where I'm going. I bring extra tools, a spare battery, a weapon. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't just the fear. It was the not knowing, the feeling of being watched, the sense that someone out there picked me for no reason at all and decided to mess with me. No motive, no pattern, just the quiet of the woods, and someone who didn't want me to leave. It was the middle of October when I decided to spend a week alone in a rented cabin up in northern Idaho. I had been working non-stop for months at my construction job and needed a break from the constant noise and stress of the city. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from Coeur d'Alene, tucked deep into the woods with no neighbors for miles. It was owned by a retired logger who only rented it out occasionally during the off-season. I got there around late afternoon. The sun was low, and the air was cold and sharp. The gravel road that led to the cabin was narrow and full of potholes. My pickup bounced around as I crept along, the thick trees pressing in close on both sides. I was already starting to feel the isolation. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked like something out of an old hunting magazine. Weathered with siding, a green metal roof, a small porch with a broken swing, and a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly beside it. No internet, no cell service, and the only power came from a small generator that I had to run a few hours each night. I brought a week's worth of food, water, and fuel. I had firewood, propane, a shotgun, and a few books. I wanted to disconnect completely. The plan was to spend time fishing at the nearby creek, hiking a bit during the day, and resting in the quiet at night. The first day was fine. I unpacked, got the generator running, made some canned chili, and sat outside wrapped in a thick jacket watching the trees sway in the wind. It was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. On the second day, I hiked out to the creek with my gear. It was about 2 miles downhill through thick pine and fir. The trail was overgrown but still visible. I spent a few hours there, caught a couple of trout, and headed back around noon. That's when I first noticed something strange. As I climbed the hill back to the cabin, I saw what looked like boot prints off the trail. They were heading in the same direction as me but seemed older, maybe from the day before or earlier that morning. I didn't think too much of it at the time. There were hunters in the area now and then. Still, I hadn't heard a single shot all morning, and I hadn't seen any parked vehicles near the trailhead. When I got back, I made a fire in the stove and cooked the fish. That night was colder, and I could hear the wind rattling the old boards of the cabin. I read for a bit, then turned in early. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. needing to pee. I slipped on my boots and grabbed a flashlight. The outhouse was about 20 yards from the cabin. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a punch. I could see my breath fog up in front of me, and the woods were pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. When I reached the outhouse, I thought I heard something in the woods to my left. It sounded like a branch snapping, followed by what could have been footsteps. I stood there, holding the flashlight toward the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The beam didn't go very far. After a minute or so, I convinced myself it was an animal. Deer were common in those woods. I finished and went back inside. The next day, I didn't hike. I felt uneasy for some reason. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, chopped more firewood, cleaned my shotgun, and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. That night, I barely slept. On the fourth day, I found something that really rattled me. I was walking around the cabin's perimeter checking the foundation when I noticed something carved into the wooden siding behind the cabin, about knee height. It looked like letters or symbols, scratched in with a knife or something sharp. They weren't there before, I would have seen them when I stacked the firewood. They weren't words I recognized, just strange, jagged lines that didn't make any sense. I stared at them for a long time, feeling my stomach turn. Someone had been behind my cabin, close enough to leave a mark. I went back inside and loaded the shotgun. I stayed in all day with the fire going. I didn't even eat. I sat near the front window watching the woods. My ears were tuned to every sound: the creak of the walls, the rustle of the trees, the occasional bird. That night, I didn't turn off the generator. I wanted the noise, even if it made me more visible. I barely slept, jerking awake every half hour. On the 5th day, I decided to leave early. I couldn't take the tension anymore. I packed everything quickly and loaded it into the truck. I was just about to lock the front door when I noticed something on the ground a few feet away. Footprints. Not mine. Not old. They were fresh, made after the rain that came late the night before. They circled the cabin. I counted at least a dozen, maybe more. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I slept. My hands were shaking as I climbed into the truck. I started the engine and took off down the trail, barely avoiding trees as I sped through the turns. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Once I got service, I called the county sheriff and told them everything. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I didn't tell many people about what happened. Most wouldn't believe me, or they'd say it was just a hunter passing through. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt. The kind of fear that gets inside your bones and stays there. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Not because of bears or cougars, but because there are people out there. People who don't want to be seen, who live in the cracks of the world, just waiting for someone like me to come a little too close. And the worst part? I'll never know how close I really got. I don't usually take time off, but I needed a break. Work had been draining me for months, and I was tired of everything. I didn't want to talk to anyone or deal with emails or even see another building. So, I found a small cabin up north, tucked in the edge of the woods near a quiet lake. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place with a stove, a cot, and no internet. That was exactly what I wanted. The road to the cabin was narrow and bumpy. It felt like the kind of place people forget exists. My cell service dropped miles before I even got close. I didn't care. I had packed everything I needed for a week: food, clothes, batteries, a flashlight, tools, and a few books. When I got there, the air smelled like pine, and the wind made a soft whisper through the trees. Felt peaceful. Or maybe I was just telling myself that. The cabin had one door and 2 small windows. There was a thin metal lock on the door, which made me a little nervous, but I reminded myself no one came out here. The inside was dusty but clean enough. I unpacked my things, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and stored my food in the old wooden cabinets. The lake was about a 5-minute walk downhill, past a row of thick trees. You couldn't see the water from the cabin, which I thought was strange at first, but it made the place feel even more isolated. I spent the first day chopping some fallen wood I found nearby and clearing out debris from the porch. That night, I sat outside with a small fire. The sky was so clear you could see every star. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but that's what I came for. No phones, no people, just me and nature. It was the second night that things started to feel off. I had just finished eating some kin soup and was reading by lantern light when I thought I heard something outside. Not an animal sound, but something like dry leaves being stepped on. I paused and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. There were plenty of animals in the woods. I let it go, but I kept hearing those footsteps almost every night after that. Always around the same time, just after dark, when everything else had gone still. I didn't see anyone. I even peeked through the window once, but it was just trees and darkness. No movement. Still, I started keeping my axe closer to the bed, just in case. One morning, I found a cigarette but on the ground about 10 feet from the porch. I don't smoke. It hadn't been there when I arrived. It looked fresh. That bothered me. Someone had been out here. Maybe they were camping nearby. Maybe they didn't know anyone was staying in the cabin. That's what I told myself. I walked the area around the cabin for a while that day, trying to see if anyone else had set up camp nearby. I didn't find anything. No tents, no fire pits, no signs of anyone. I hiked to the lake and checked the shoreline too. Nothing. The water was cold and dark, and the air felt heavy. I didn't stay long. That night, the footsteps were louder, slower, not like an animal running or scurrying. They were steady, pacing, like someone walking in a circle. I stayed completely still on the cot, listening. My flashlight was in my hand, ready to click on. But the footsteps didn't come up to the porch. They just circled the cabin for almost an hour. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin and saw more cigarette butts. 3 of them, spaced out in a line near the tree line. That was enough for me. I started thinking about leaving. Maybe it wasn't worth the quiet if I had to wonder whether someone was out there watching me every night. But I had a few days left, and a part of me didn't want to be chased away. I had come out here to get away, and I didn't want to give that up just because someone else had bad habits. So I stayed. I kept my flashlight, my axe, and even a whistle with me all the time now. Then one morning I found something else. A boot print, right below the cabin's back window. It hadn't been there before. The ground was soft from the rain overnight, and the print was deep and clear. It wasn't mine. I checked my boots and compared the tread. It didn't match. This print was larger, wider. That day, I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the door locked and watched from the window. Nothing happened during the day, but when night fell, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to give away my position. I stayed in the dark, listening. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing just outside the window near the cot. I didn't move. My body was tight with fear. I gripped the axe and stared into the dark. The breathing stayed for maybe 10 minutes. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I packed my bag. I wasn't going to wait for things to get worse. I didn't care if I had days left on the rental. I was done. I hiked back to my car and drove until my phone had service again. I called the local sheriff's office and told them what I found. The cigarette butts, the boot print, the sounds at night. They said they'd send someone out to check, but I never heard back. Maybe they didn't find anything. Maybe they didn't look. I don't know. All I know is that I never went back. I never will. That week in the woods was supposed to help me relax. Instead, it showed me something I didn't want to see. How fast peace can turn into paranoia. How the woods can hide more than just animals. I still go hiking sometimes, but I don't stay overnight. Not anymore. And I never go anywhere I can't leave in less than 10 minutes. The cabin's probably still there. Maybe someone else is staying in it now. I hope they're alone. Really alone. But I doubt it. It was early September when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the northern forests of Washington state. I'd found the place through a forum that catered to solo campers and wilderness survivalists. The owner had posted that the small off-grid cabin was up for rent at a very low price, mainly because it was far from the nearest road and not accessible by vehicle. You had to hike in about 5 miles through thick woods. I packed carefully. A good sleeping bag, extra blankets, food that didn't need refrigeration, a few cans of beans, trail mix, protein bars, a large water filter pump, a GPS, a compass, bear spray, and a .22 rifle just in case. I also brought my solar-powered power bank and a few rechargeable lights. My phone wasn't going to get any signal out there, but I brought it anyway, mostly for taking pictures. The trail started from a small gravel pull-off on the side of a Forest Service road. There was no real marker, just a small orange ribbon tied to a tree branch that matched the instructions the owner had emailed me. I parked my old SUV on the gravel, locked everything, threw on my backpack, and started walking. The hike took longer than I expected. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, and the terrain was rough. I kept checking the GPS coordinates he'd given me to make sure I was still going in the right direction. After about 3.5 hours, I found the cabin. It was small, built from dark, weathered logs. The roof was metal and slightly rusted around the edges. A single brick chimney poked out of the top. There was a small porch with an old rocking chair and a set of antlers nailed above the door. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but it was solid. Inside, there was a wood stove, a single cot with a thin mattress, a table with one chair, and some shelves that held a few canned goods and old tools. There was a small axe leaning against the wall and a pile of chopped wood stacked near the door. A big cast iron pan hung on a nail beside the stove. The windows had heavy wooden shutters on the inside you could latch shut at night. I dropped my pack, rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot, and unpacked slowly. I wanted this trip to be about slowing down. No phone, no people, just nature. I had brought a few books and a journal. I planned to hike during the day, cook simple meals, read, and rest. I was burned out from my job, and this was supposed to be my reset. That first night, I was tired from the hike and fell asleep early. I kept the shutters open so I could see the trees swaying in the moonlight. It was quiet out there. No traffic sounds, no voices, just the wind and the occasional crack of a branch. Around midnight, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. It wasn't cold, and I didn't need to pee. I just suddenly opened my eyes, wide awake. I listened. First, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a snapping sound, like a footstep on dry wood. I sat up slowly and looked at the window. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but I stared for a while. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, or even a raccoon. I'd left the food sealed and high, so I doubted anything would get in. I didn't move from the cot, just sat there listening. More snapping, then silence. I didn't sleep much the rest of the night. I kept the rifle close to me and watched the shadows until morning light started leaking in through the trees. The next day, I went for a hike. I tried to shake off the nerves. The forest was beautiful, moss-covered trees, the smell of pine and damp soil. I followed a stream for a while, found a flat rock, and sat down to eat a protein bar. I didn't see or hear anything strange. When I got back to the cabin, though, I noticed something. The rocking chair on the porch had moved. I'd left it facing the woods, but now it was turned slightly toward the door, just a little. I stood there for a while, trying to remember for sure how I'd left it. Maybe the wind had pushed it. That night, I locked the shutters and kept the fire going longer. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. I kept hearing little sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, the kind of stuff that makes you stop and hold your breath. I figured it was probably small animals, rabbits, squirrels, raccoons. I woke again in the middle of the night. This time it was different. There was a sound like something scraping against the outside wall. Not loud, but slow. I got up, grabbed the rifle, and stood near the door. My heart was racing. The fire was low, just glowing coals. I waited, not sure what to do. The scraping stopped. Then nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night again. By the third day, I was jumpy. I didn't enjoy my hike. I kept looking over my shoulder. I tried to explore a little deeper into the woods, but found myself turning back early. I wasn't in the mood for adventure anymore. When I got back, I found more signs that someone, or something, had been near the cabin. A small pile of rocks had been stacked near the fire pit outside. I hadn't done that. They weren't there when I left. They weren't natural. It looked like someone had deliberately balanced them. I decided not to stay out another night. I planned to leave first thing in the morning. I boiled water for some beans, ate quietly, and double-checked my pack. I latched all the shutters again, loaded the rifle, and laid down without turning off the light. I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. There was a sound right outside the wall again. This time it was more than scraping. It sounded like a hand, or something like a hand, running slowly along the wall of the cabin. I could hear the tips of fingers brushing the wood, moving from one end to the other. I stood up slowly, heart pounding. I didn't want to look out the window. I didn't want to open the door. I just stood in the middle of the room with the rifle pointed at the floor, listening. The sound moved around the corner. Then it stopped. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the front wall. Not the door, the wall beside it, like someone had hit it with their palm. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like an 1 hour. I didn't sit. I didn't move. Morning eventually came. I packed as fast as I could, rolled up the sleeping bag, and shoved everything into my pack. I didn't eat. I didn't even take water. I just wanted to get out. Outside, the air was cold. The woods were silent. I looked around carefully. Nothing was out of place except for the pile of rocks, which now had a small stick standing straight up in the center. I left. The hike back felt twice as long. Every little sound made me jump. I didn't stop once. When I reached the gravel road and saw my SUV, I almost cried. I tossed the pack inside, started the engine, and drove. I never contacted the owner. I never left a review. I didn't tell anyone the full story for months. When I finally did, I left out some parts. To this day, I don't know what was out there, but I know it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a raccoon. Whatever it was, it watched me. It stayed quiet until the nights, touched the cabin. It rearranged things. It wanted me to know it was there. I haven't gone camping alone since, and I never will again. It was early November when I drove up to the mountains alone, looking for peace and quiet. I had rented a small wooden cabin that sat on a slope about 2 miles from the nearest road. It was one of those places with no phone signal, no internet, and nothing but tall trees and rock-strewn trails all around. The kind of silence that made your ears ring. The cabin was small, just one room and a loft with a bed, a small fireplace, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a kitchenette that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. There was no electricity, only a propane tank for the stove and an old lantern hanging from a hook. Outside, there was a shed off to the right and an outhouse about 50 feet into the woods. It was cold, not freezing, but the kind of chill that got into your bones if you stood still too long. I spent the first day bringing my stuff in from the truck and chopping wood. I stacked it under the lean-to beside the cabin and kept enough inside to last through the night. As the sun went down, I lit a fire, made some canned chili on the stove, and sat on the wooden chair with a heavy blanket over my legs. The wind picked up after dark, whispering through the trees. The branches scratched against the roof, but I didn't think much of it. I had a few books with me, so I read until my eyes got too heavy, then climbed up to the loft and burrowed into the sleeping bag. I left the fire going, just low enough to keep the place warm. Around midnight, I woke up needing to use the outhouse. I didn't want to, not in the dark and cold, but I couldn't hold it. I put on my boots, grabbed the lantern, and stepped outside. The wind had died, and everything was still. Too still. There wasn't a single sound, no birds, no bugs, nothing. As I walked toward the outhouse, the lantern flickered, and I had to stop to adjust the knob. That's when I thought I heard something behind me. Not a twig snap, not leaves, something softer, a footstep. I turned around, but all I saw was the cabin behind me, dimly lit by the firelight through the window. I stood there for a good minute, heart thumping. Then I finished up, hurried back inside, and bolted the door. I told myself it was just my nerves, being alone out in the woods. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was covered in pine needles and frost, so I couldn't tell if there had been tracks. Nothing looked out of place. I spent the rest of the day hiking a bit, chopping more wood, and trying to ignore how uneasy I felt. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, just quick flashes. But every time I looked, there was nothing. On the 3rd day, I went out to the shed to get some more supplies. The door was partly open, which was strange because I was sure I'd closed it. Inside, the tools had been moved, not taken, just rearranged. An axe that I had left hanging was now leaning against the wall. A rope I had coiled neatly was unspooled across the floor. I checked the cabin again, but everything was where I had left it. That night, I pushed the table and chairs against the door, just in case. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, thinking I heard creaking on the porch. But when I looked out the loft window, I couldn't see anything. It was too dark. By the 5th day, I wanted to leave. I packed my bags and started the hike back down to where I had parked. But when I got to the spot, my truck was gone. At first I thought I was in the wrong place, but I knew I wasn't. There were the same trees, the same boulder with the moss, the same path I had taken up. My truck just wasn't there. I stood there for an hour, pacing in circles, checking the map, looking for tire tracks. Nothing. I wasn't stupid. I locked the doors when I left it. I still had the keys in my jacket pocket, but the truck was just gone. I didn't know what to do. I had enough food for another 3 days if I rationed, and there was a small creek nearby for water. I thought maybe a ranger or another hiker might come through, so I went back to the cabin and waited. That night, the firewood stack outside had been knocked over. All of it, like someone had come through and kicked it. I stayed up all night, staring at the door, holding the axe. The next day, I found boot prints. Not mine. These were larger, deeper. They went around the back of the cabin, stopped at the window, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't leave the cabin for the next 2 days. I kept the fire low, didn't use the lantern, and barely moved. I heard movement outside. Not animals. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Once, I saw someone walk past the window. I didn't see their face, just a silhouette. They didn't knock. They didn't try the door. They just walked by and disappeared. By the 9th day, I was almost out of food and wood. I hadn't slept more than an hour at a time. My eyes were bloodshot, my hands shook, and my body ached from tension. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I had to get out. I made a plan. I packed what I could carry and left at first light. I didn't follow the trail. I went straight downhill, hoping to hit a road or a ranger station. I walked all day, barely stopping. Around dusk, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I followed it for what felt like miles until I saw a parked truck. A guy was standing next to it, checking a tire. I almost collapsed when I saw him. He gave me a ride into town. I told him someone had stolen my truck. When we got to the sheriff's office, I filed a report. They sent someone to look for it. The weirdest part? They found it right where I had left it, parked and locked, with no signs of forced entry. I know I checked that exact spot. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't want any of my stuff. I told the rental company I had left early because of a family emergency. I never told them what really happened. Weeks later, I still couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those boot prints, about the person outside the window, about how someone had moved my truck and brought it back without a trace. I changed all my locks, got cameras, moved to a different apartment. Nothing strange has happened since. But I still don't know who was out there, or what they wanted, or how long they had been watching me. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window again. I don't think I'll ever go into the woods alone again. It was early November when I took some time off work. I had been working non-stop for months and badly needed to get away from the city. I found a listing for a cabin deep in the mountains, around 3 hours from the nearest town. The place was basic, no internet or cell reception, but it had solar power, a small fireplace, a stocked kitchen, and a generator for backup. It sounded perfect. The drive there was long, mostly silent, just the sound of my tires on the road and static-filled radio stations that faded the deeper I drove into the wilderness. The last stretch of road was just dirt and gravel, winding steeply up through dense trees. I passed nobody after the last gas station, and it felt like the forest swallowed me whole. The GPS gave up halfway, and I followed written directions the owner emailed me. Eventually, I found the turnoff, just a narrow trail barely wider than my car. The cabin sat on a slope, tucked between thick trees with a clearing that opened out into the edge of a drop. Below was a long stretch of forest and hills, and you could barely make out a creek in the distance. It was peaceful, and for the first few hours, it felt like I had finally escaped everything. Inside, the cabin was small but neat. One room served as the kitchen and living space, and a door led to a tiny bedroom with a single bed. The bathroom had a working toilet and a small shower. The windows were clean, the floors swept, and the fridge was running from the solar power. I unpacked, set up a small reading area, and started a fire in the fireplace to get rid of the chill. By nightfall, I was sitting with a hot cup of coffee and nothing but the sound of wind in the trees. The first night was uneventful, though the silence was louder than I expected. I kept waking up, not to any sound, but to the lack of it. No cars, no people, no hum of appliances. Just the occasional creak of the old cabin as it settled. I shrugged it off and told myself I was just adjusting to the isolation. The next morning, I woke up around 6 and stepped outside. The air was cold, but fresh. I made breakfast and then decided to take a hike along a narrow trail behind the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map, but the owner mentioned it in his notes. It went about 2 miles downhill toward the creek. I took a flashlight, some water, and a small knife just in case. The trail was quiet and a bit overgrown, but I made it to the water without a problem. I spent about an hour near the creek, skipping rocks and sitting on an old log. It felt nice to just exist without my phone buzzing. I started heading back up, which was much slower. Halfway up, I noticed something strange. Some broken branches and what looked like footprints off the trail. They weren't boot prints like mine. They were wider, flatter, almost like someone had walked barefoot. But it was too cold for that, and the prints weren't fresh. They looked like they had been made a day or two ago. I figured maybe someone else used this trail and moved on. That night, after dinner, I was reading near the fireplace when I heard something outside. It was faint, like twigs snapping. I turned off the light and stood still. Nothing for a minute, then another soft crack, closer this time. I peeked out the window, but it was pitch dark outside. I didn't see anything, probably just a deer or a raccoon. I went to bed but didn't sleep well. The wind picked up and kept tapping branches against the cabin. Once or twice, I thought I heard soft thuds, like someone stepping on the porch, but I couldn't be sure. I told myself I was overthinking it. The third day, I stayed near the cabin. I chopped some firewood, cleaned the place a bit, and made a list of food supplies. I still had plenty, but I liked to be prepared. I explored the edge of the slope near the clearing. There were a few small animal bones, probably from birds or squirrels. I didn't think much of it. Predators lived out here. Later, I went down the trail again to see if I could find more of those footprints. I followed the same path, and sure enough, they were still there. But this time, I noticed there were more. Some looked newer, like someone else had walked through that morning, still barefoot. I started to feel uneasy. I looked around but didn't see or hear anything. I returned to the cabin faster than before, kept the knife in my hand the whole time. That night, I locked the doors, shut the windows, and lit a fire early. I didn't read or do much, just listened. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Not inside, but right outside the bedroom window. It was soft but steady. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. I froze. I didn't move or make a sound. The breathing stayed there for maybe a minute, then moved away. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I checked outside. Nothing obvious. But when I looked under the bedroom window, I saw footprints. Bare feet, clear as day. They were smaller than mine, but still adult-sized. The ground was hard, but there was just enough moisture for the dirt to hold the print. My stomach turned. I made a decision. I packed up my things and planned to leave the next day. It was already late morning, and I didn't want to risk driving down the steep road in the dark. I spent the rest of the day inside, barely touching my food. I kept the knife close. I even set up some makeshift noise traps. Pots stacked near the door, a line of empty cans near the window. That night was long. The wind was still. The forest was quiet. I sat in a chair by the door with the fire burning low, just waiting. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a soft clang. Then another. The cans. Someone had tripped them. I grabbed the flashlight and knife and looked out. Nothing at first, then movement. Just a flash. Something ducked behind the edge of the porch. I backed away. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to confront anyone. I stayed up until daylight, not blinking much. When the sun came up, I packed the last of my things and got in the car. I drove fast, barely looking back. The trail was rough, but I made it down. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station on the highway. I used the payphone to call the cabin owner and told him someone might be trespassing up there. He didn't seem surprised. He said something like, "Yeah, sometimes that happens," but wouldn't go into detail. I didn't care. I just wanted to go home. I never went back. For weeks, I kept checking the locks at night. I dreamed about that soft breathing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was out there wasn't just passing by. They were watching, maybe for days. The cabin had seemed perfect, peaceful, but I learned something. Isolation can feel nice in theory, but out there, completely cut off, you start to realize how vulnerable you are, how far you are from help, from anyone. And the scariest part? I never saw their face. I don't know who or what they wanted, and that unknown is what stayed with me the most. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone, and never without cell service. Never again. It was early October when I drove up into the mountains to stay at a small cabin I had rented online. I wanted a break from the noise, the people, and the screens. Life had started to feel too loud. I wasn't running from anything big, no major trauma or disaster, just the buildup of little things. Work stress, city noise, my phone always buzzing. I needed to get away from it all, even if only for a week. So I picked a spot that was far enough to feel isolated, but not too far that I couldn't drive back if something came up. The cabin was about 4 hours away from home, tucked deep in the forest near a small, nearly forgotten dirt road. When I arrived, it was just past 3 p.m. The sun was still high, and the sky was clear. The road had turned from paved to gravel a few miles back, and now it was nothing but dirt and fallen leaves. The cabin was exactly what I expected based on the photos. Small, square, weathered wood, a little porch out front with 2 old chairs, and a narrow chimney. A woodpile sat near the side. No other buildings in sight. There was a clearing around the cabin, but trees circled it tightly. Pines, tall and dark, and a few dead trees scattered in between. The forest floor was thick with dry needles, twigs, and rocks. Inside, the cabin was one open room, aside from a small bathroom. A bed against the back wall, a wood stove in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, a kitchenette with an old gas stove and a little fridge. The windows were small but clean. I opened one to let the air in. It smelled like pine and cold dirt. There was no phone signal, which I expected. I had brought books, a notepad, and plenty of food. Felt good. Felt quiet. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, walked around the woods a bit, made dinner, and lit a fire in the stove. It crackled warmly and filled the place with a dry, smoky heat. That night, I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke early, before the sun. It was cold. I added logs to the stove and made coffee. Steam curled from the mug as I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. The trees didn't move. Everything was still. Around noon, I hiked deeper into the woods, using an old trail I found behind the cabin. It was narrow and overgrown in places. I followed it for about an hour before heading back. There were no signs of other people, no footprints, no litter, just the sound of my boots on leaves and the occasional bird. That night, I noticed something strange. I had left my boots just outside the front door, like I always do, but when I went to get them in the morning, they had been moved. Not far, just a few feet to the side. I figured maybe I had nudged them by accident, or maybe a raccoon had sniffed them. I shook them out to make sure nothing was inside and forgot about it. By the 4th day, more little things had changed. A spoon I had used was missing. One of the chairs on the porch was turned around. A log I had stacked was lying on the ground. None of it felt threatening at first, just odd. Maybe I was being forgetful. Maybe the wind. Maybe animals. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I started locking the door at night, which I hadn't been doing the first few nights. The door had 2 locks, a knob lock and a thick deadbolt. I used both. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The fire was low, just glowing embers. The cabin was very quiet. I listened. At first, I thought it was nothing, but then I heard a sound outside. Leaves crunching. Slow, careful steps. Not the scurry of an animal. Heavier. I held my breath. The steps circled the cabin. They stopped, then started again. I stayed still in the bed. No lights on. I didn't move. The steps stopped near the front door. Then I heard the faintest rattle, like someone trying the doorknob. It was quiet, almost too careful. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then more crunching steps, fading slowly around the cabin and into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the door. It was still locked. I stepped outside and looked around. No boot prints, but the ground was hard and covered with pine needles. I walked the perimeter. Nothing obvious. But one thing stuck out. The chair that had been turned before was now back in place, but the other one was moved slightly, almost like someone had sat in it. I couldn't prove it, but I felt it. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept a knife in my pocket and checked the locks every hour. By evening, I was debating leaving early, but I convinced myself it was just paranoia. I told myself I had imagined the steps. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear sniffing around. That night, I blocked the door with the table. I also jammed a stick into the sliding window to keep it from opening. I kept the knife beside the bed. I didn't start a fire this time, thinking the light might draw attention. The cabin was cold and dark. At some point past midnight, I heard a soft thud. Not loud, just enough to wake me. I sat up, listening. The sound came again. Then a slow scraping like something being dragged. Then silence. I waited. After a while, I got up and tiptoed to the window. I didn't open the curtain, just peeked through a tiny gap. At first, I didn't see anything, but then my eyes adjusted. Someone was standing near the edge of the trees, just barely visible, not moving, not doing anything, just standing. I watched for what felt like forever. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night again. In the morning, I packed everything. I filled my car and locked the cabin. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just wanted to leave. When I got to the dirt road, my tires slipped a little, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I didn't see anyone on the drive back, just miles and miles of empty forest. Later, when I was home and calmer, I checked the listing for the cabin. It was still there. I looked through the reviews. Most were old. One caught my eye. It was vague, said something about strange noises and feeling watched. No one else had mentioned anything. A few days later, I got an email from the rental site asking if I wanted to review my stay. I didn't want anyone thinking I was making things up or being dramatic. I just didn't go back. Sometimes I still think about the chair, about the person in the woods. I wonder how long they were watching. I wonder if they were there the first night, or if I led them there by accident. I don't know. I never will. But I do know I won't be going back to a cabin like that again. Not without someone else. Not that far from help. Not that deep in the trees. The quiet I had wanted so badly ended up being the thing that scared me the most. Because out there, no one would have heard me if I screamed. And whoever was out there, they knew it. It was early October when I drove up to a remote cabin deep in the northern Minnesota woods. The trees had already started to turn color, and the narrow gravel road leading into the forest was covered in dry, crunchy leaves. The air was crisp and cold, and I could smell the faint scent of pine and damp earth as I drove with the window cracked. I had rented the place for a week to get away from everything. I'd just gone through a tough breakup. I was tired of the noise in the city, and I needed to be alone for a while. No phones, no internet, no people, just quiet. The cabin was small, just a one-bedroom place with a tiny kitchen, a front porch, and a wood stove. It was about 40 minutes from the nearest town and sat right on the edge of a small, shallow lake. There were no other cabins nearby, and the closest neighbor was about 4 miles away down the road. Felt exactly like what I needed. I arrived just before sunset. The light was low and golden, spilling through the trees and making long shadows on the porch. The cabin creaked when I stepped inside, and it smelled like old wood, dust, and a little bit of mildew. I didn't mind it. There was a stack of firewood next to the stove, a small bed with a flannel blanket, and some canned food in the pantry. I'd brought most of my own supplies: dry food, bottled water, a lantern, a knife, and a few books. I figured I'd hike, read, and sleep. That was the plan. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. It's strange how silence can feel loud when you're used to hearing city noise. I kept waking up, not because of sounds, but because of the lack of them. There was no hum of traffic, no distant sirens, no voices, just stillness. I thought it would be peaceful, but it felt hollow. On the second day, I went for a long hike through the woods. There were no trails, so I followed a dry creek bed and marked trees with small notches in the bark so I could find my way back. I walked for about 3 hours, didn't see another person, and only saw one deer. Everything felt untouched, wild. I liked it. Back at the cabin that evening, I started to get a weird feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, just a sense that something was slightly off. I had set up some small traps around the cabin earlier in the day just for fun, to see if I could catch a rabbit. One of them had been sprung, but whatever had triggered it got away. The snare was broken, and the stick holding the loop was snapped clean in two. I thought maybe a fox or raccoon had gotten at it, so I reset it and tried not to think too much about it. That night, I heard something outside. Not animals, not wind, something slow, heavy. I was lying in bed, wrapped in the blanket, when I heard soft crunching steps outside on the leaves. They moved around the back of the cabin, then stopped. I held my breath. I didn't have a gun, only a hunting knife I kept next to the bed. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a bear. I didn't move until the sound faded away. The next morning, I found one of the wooden steps leading to the porch cracked in half. I hadn't noticed it before. The wood was split clean down the middle, and the nails looked like they'd been pried up. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't look like it had happened from weight. It looked intentional. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it had rotted and finally gave way. Maybe. I didn't go for a hike that day. I stayed close to the cabin and tried to act normal. I chopped some firewood, read a bit, cooked some beans on the portable stove. But I kept looking into the trees. I didn't feel alone anymore. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing soft noises, branches snapping, something brushing against the cabin wall, a soft metallic tapping like something scraping against the propane tank outside. I kept checking the window, but it was too dark to see anything. On the fourth day, I woke up to find all 3 of my traps gone. Not just triggered, but completely missing. The notched sticks I had jammed into the ground were pulled up, and the snares were gone. No drag marks, no snapped wire, nothing. I walked about a quarter mile into the woods searching, but there was no sign of them. Back at the cabin, I noticed the door didn't close right anymore. The frame was slightly warped, like someone had leaned or pushed hard against it. It made a creaking noise when I touched it, and I saw fresh scratch marks near the handle. They weren't deep like claws, more like shallow scrapes from metal. I started to get paranoid. I checked all the windows, locked. I pushed the table up against the front door that night. I kept my knife close. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found boot prints in the mud near the lake. Large ones, way bigger than mine. Deep too, like the person had been carrying weight. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the underbrush. The direction wasn't toward the road. It circled back toward the cabin. That was the first time I considered leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe someone was messing with me. I hated not knowing. That evening, I heard a thud on the roof. Just one. A dull, heavy sound. Then nothing. I didn't go outside. On the 6th day, something changed. I was out by the lake just after sunrise, trying to catch some fish. The water was perfectly still, and a thin layer of mist floated just above the surface. I heard something behind me, near the tree-line. A quick rustle, then the sharp crack of a branch. I turned, knife in hand, but there was nothing there. Then I saw something low to the ground, way off in the trees. Not a person, not an animal, just movement. A crouched shape that ducked out of view the second I looked directly at it. My heart pounded in my chest. I walked backward to the cabin, never taking my eyes off the trees. That night was the worst. It started with scratching, not loud, just faint, along the back wall of the cabin. Then the porch creaked. Then something knocked. A single, soft knock on the side of the cabin. Not the door, just the wall. I sat in the dark, holding my knife, shaking. I could hear my own breathing, and I could feel how cold the air had gotten inside. I waited, Hours passed. The noises stopped. In the morning, I packed everything. I didn't care about the rental period. I didn't care about the food I hadn't finished. I just wanted to leave. But when I stepped out onto the porch, I found something that stopped me cold. Hanging from the nail where I'd strung up a small bag of food was one of my missing snares, tied into a knot. A neat, tight knot. Someone had returned it. That was it for me. I didn't even clean the place up. I threw my bags in the car, locked the door behind me, and got in. I drove down that gravel road faster than I should have, watching the tree lean in the rearview mirror the whole time. I didn't see anything following me, but I didn't feel safe until I hit the highway. A week later, I reported the cabin and the area to the local sheriff's office. They said they'd check it out. I never heard back. To this day, I don't know if it was just some backwoods person messing with me, or if it was someone living out there off-grid, watching. But I do know one thing: I was not alone, and I will never go back there again. It was early October when I drove up into the mountains to stay at a small cabin I had rented online. I wanted a break from the noise, the people, and the screens. Life had started to feel too loud. I wasn't running from anything big, no major trauma or disaster, just the buildup of little things. Work stress, city noise, my phone always buzzing. I needed to get away from it all, even if only for a week. So I picked a spot that was far enough to feel isolated, but not too far that I couldn't drive back if something came up. The cabin was about 4 hours away from home, tucked deep in the forest near a small, nearly forgotten dirt road. When I arrived, it was just past 3 p.m. The sun was still high, and the sky was clear. The road had turned from paved to gravel a few miles back, and now it was nothing but dirt and fallen leaves. The cabin was exactly what I expected based on the photos. Small, square, weathered wood, a little porch out front with 2 old chairs, and a narrow chimney. A woodpile sat near the side. No other buildings in sight. There was a clearing around the cabin, but trees circled it tightly. Pines, tall and dark, and a few dead trees scattered in between. The forest floor was thick with dry needles, twigs, and rocks. Inside, the cabin was one open room, aside from a small bathroom. A bed against the back wall, a wood stove in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, a kitchenette with an old gas stove and a little fridge. The windows were small but clean. I opened one to let the air in. It smelled like pine and cold dirt. There was no phone signal, which I expected. I had brought books, a notepad, and plenty of food. Felt good. Felt quiet. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked, walked around the woods a bit, made dinner, and lit a fire in the stove. It crackled warmly and filled the place with a dry, smoky heat. That night, I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke early, before the sun. It was cold. I added logs to the stove and made coffee. Steam curled from the mug as I sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. The trees didn't move. Everything was still. Around noon, I hiked deeper into the woods, using an old trail I found behind the cabin. It was narrow and overgrown in places. I followed it for about an hour before heading back. There were no signs of other people, no footprints, no litter, just the sound of my boots on leaves and the occasional bird. That night, I noticed something strange. I had left my boots just outside the front door, like I always do, but when I went to get them in the morning, they had been moved. Not far, just a few feet to the side. I figured maybe I had nudged them by accident, or maybe a raccoon had sniffed them. I shook them out to make sure nothing was inside and forgot about it. By the 4th day, more little things had changed. A spoon I had used was missing. One of the chairs on the porch was turned around. A log I had stacked was lying on the ground. None of it felt threatening at first, just odd. Maybe I was being forgetful. Maybe the wind. Maybe animals. But deep down, something didn't feel right. I started locking the door at night, which I hadn't been doing the first few nights. The door had 2 locks, a knob lock and a thick deadbolt. I used both. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure why. The fire was low, just glowing embers. The cabin was very quiet. I listened. At first, I thought it was nothing, but then I heard a sound outside. leaves crunching, slow, careful steps, not the scurry of an animal. Heavier. I held my breath. The steps circled the cabin. They stopped, then started again. I stayed still in the bed. No lights on. I didn't move. The steps stopped near the front door. Then I heard the faintest rattle, like someone trying the doorknob. It was quiet, almost too careful. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then more crunching steps, fading slowly around the cabin and into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the door. It was still locked. I stepped outside and looked around. No boot prints, but the ground was hard and covered with pine needles. I walked the perimeter. Nothing obvious, but one thing stuck out. The chair that had been turned before was now back in place, but the other one was moved slightly, almost like someone had sat in it. I couldn't prove it, but I felt it. I didn't hike that day. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept a knife in my pocket and checked the locks every hour. By evening, I was debating leaving early, but I convinced myself it was just paranoia. I told myself I had imagined the steps. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear sniffing around. That night, I blocked the door with the table. I also jammed a stick into the sliding window to keep it from opening. I kept the knife beside the bed. I didn't start a fire this time, thinking the light might draw attention. The cabin was cold and dark. At some point past midnight, I heard a soft thud, not loud, just enough to wake me. I sat up, listening. The sound came again, then a slow scraping like something being dragged, then silence. I waited. After a while, I got up and tiptoed to the window. I didn't open the curtain, just peeked through a tiny gap. At first, I didn't see anything, but then my eyes adjusted. Someone was standing near the edge of the trees, just barely visible, not moving, not doing anything, just standing. I watched for what felt like forever. Then they turned and walked back into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night again. In the morning, I packed everything. I filled my car and locked the cabin. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just wanted to leave. When I got to the dirt road, my tires slipped a little, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I didn't see anyone on the drive back, just miles and miles of empty forest. Later, when I was home and calmer, I checked the listing for the cabin. It was still there. I looked through the reviews. Most were old. One caught my eye. It was vague, said something about strange noises and feeling watched. No one else had mentioned anything. A few days later, I got an email from the rental site asking if I wanted to review my stay. I didn't want anyone thinking I was making things up or being dramatic. I just didn't go back. Sometimes I still think about the chair, about the person in the woods. I wonder how long they were watching. I wonder if they were there the first night, or if I led them there by accident. I don't know. I never will. But I do know I won't be going back to a cabin like that again. Not without someone else. Not that far from help. Not that deep in the trees. The quiet I had wanted so badly ended up being the thing that scared me the most. Because out there, no one would have heard me if I screamed. And whoever was out there, they knew it. It started off as just a simple plan to get away from everything. I'd been dealing with so much stress over the past few months that I needed to be somewhere far away from my phone, my job, and people. I was exhausted. My sleep schedule was destroyed. My back hurt all the time from sitting at a desk, and even the small things were starting to feel like they were too much. So I took some time off and booked a cabin way up north in a quiet, forested part of Minnesota. A place surrounded by trees, far away from the nearest town. No internet, no neighbors. I picked the location because it was supposed to be peaceful. A basic wooden cabin, just one floor, no basement, no upstairs. Just a single space with a bathroom, a small kitchen, and a bedroom area. There was no TV, just a wood stove for heat, some old furniture, and a large deck that faced the forest. The guy who rented it out said it was an old hunting cabin. He said he didn't go up there anymore, but he still kept it in decent shape. When I first got there, everything seemed fine. took about 5 hours to drive from my place. Once I turned off the main highway, I drove another 40 minutes on dirt roads until I found the small wooden sign nailed to a tree that pointed toward the cabin. It was tucked about half a mile off the trail. There wasn't even a proper driveway, just a path of flattened grass and weeds where the tires had pressed over time. When I finally parked and stepped out, the air felt completely different, cold and quiet, just the sounds of birds and the wind moving through the trees. No cars, no voices, nothing but nature. I settled in quickly. I brought a lot of supplies: non-perishable food, bottled water, some basic tools, a knife, and my sleeping bag just in case the bedding there was too musty. I also brought a battery-powered radio, a flashlight, and extra batteries. I wasn't planning to use my phone for anything other than emergencies, and I had a backup battery pack for it just in case. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, took a short walk through the woods nearby, came back, cooked some soup on the propane burner, and spent the evening reading. I remember thinking I'd made the right choice. I even slept better than I had in months. The second day, I woke up early, made some instant coffee, and sat out on the deck wrapped in a blanket. The forest was so still, but not in a bad way. It was peaceful. The air smelled like pine and cold soil. I could hear woodpeckers hammering in the distance. Later in the day, I decided to do some more walking. I marked trees with orange ribbon as I walked so I wouldn't get lost. I followed a path along a dry creek bed and found a rock outcrop that gave me a view over the treetops. I stayed there a while. Then I went back to the cabin, made dinner, and went to bed early. It was during the third night that things started to feel different. I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it might have just been a branch falling or an animal, but I kept hearing it: soft, spaced out cracks, like twigs snapping under pressure. Not fast, one every few seconds, then silence, then another snap. It was hard to tell where it was coming from. It wasn't windy that night, and the sound wasn't consistent enough to be an animal moving normally. I stayed in bed for a while, listening. Eventually, it stopped. The next morning, I went out to check. I didn't see anything strange, but I did notice something that hadn't been there before. A small mark in the dirt right off the corner of the deck. It looked like someone had stepped there, but the shape wasn't very clear. Could have been a deer, I told myself. Could have been a bear. But it was close to the cabin, and it looked like someone had pressed their weight into the spot deliberately. That day, I kept my walk short. I didn't go too far. I stayed in sight of the cabin the entire time. I don't know why, but I just didn't feel comfortable walking deeper into the woods that day. When I went back inside, I made sure to lock the door. I even pushed one of the chairs under the knob. I didn't usually do that, but something was eating at me. Nothing looked wrong inside, but that night it happened again. Same sound, snapping twigs, very slow, spaced apart, like someone was moving around carefully outside. I didn't have curtains on the windows, just those thin wooden shutters. I didn't open them. I didn't want to look. I stayed completely still in bed with the blanket pulled up over me, even though I knew that wouldn't do anything. I kept my phone in my hand the whole night. I didn't fall back asleep until the sun came up. In the daylight, everything looked normal again. I started to wonder if I was just freaking myself out. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin slowly, trying not to panic. I found more marks in the dirt. They weren't shoe prints exactly, but they looked like someone had pressed the edge of something heavy into the soil. The spots were uneven, and they led into the woods behind the cabin. I spent most of that day trying to calm down. I made food. I read. I sat on the deck for a while, but I was on edge the entire time. Every sound made me freeze. I didn't go for a walk. I didn't want to leave the cabin. That night, I didn't go to bed right away. I sat in the chair by the window with the flashlight and my knife in my lap. I didn't want to use the light and give away my position, so I sat in the dark. Around midnight, the sounds started again. Same slow snapping of twigs. This time, they were closer. I couldn't see anything out the window. The moonlight made the trees look like shadows. I held my breath and waited. The sound stopped after about 10 minutes. Then I heard something new. A dull, heavy sound, like something being set down on the porch. Not dropped, placed. Slowly. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I sat like that until the sun started to rise. When it was light enough to see, I opened the front door slowly, stepping out with the knife in my hand. On the wooden boards of the deck, there was something sitting there. A rock, big, round, and clean. It wasn't there the day before. It was just placed in the center of the porch like someone left it for me. I didn't know what to think. My first thought was maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe a hunter or someone from the area was trying to scare me. But the place was so isolated. I hadn't seen another vehicle on the road for miles. No tire tracks, nothing. And who would drive that far into the woods just to play mind games with a stranger? It was late October when I decided to spend a few quiet days alone in an old cabin up north. I'd rented it online through a small ad that looked almost too plain to notice. It was buried under other listings, barely had any pictures, but something about it drew me in. I'd been stressed for weeks. Too much work, no sleep, bad diet, and I felt like I needed to get away before I snapped. This place seemed isolated, simple, and cheap. That was all I needed. The drive up was long and boring. Flat roads, then winding dirt tracks through thick trees that looked the same for miles. My phone signal got worse the further I went. At some point, the GPS just stopped, and I had to go by the printed directions the owner had emailed me. I had the windows down, cold air biting at my face, trying to keep me awake. I hadn't slept much the night before because I'd been packing and trying to finish up last-minute work. I could feel the headache building behind my eyes. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even more worn out than in the pictures. A small wooden structure sitting on a patch of dirt, surrounded by tall trees with yellow and brown leaves falling everywhere. The roof sagged a little in the middle. The wooden steps creaked when I walked up. The door handle was rusty but worked fine. Inside, it was dusty, cold, and smelled like old wood and something slightly rotten, like a wet log that's been sitting too long. I dropped my bag on the floor and looked around. There was a small kitchen area, an old fridge, a table with 2 chairs, a living space with a wood stove, and a single bedroom with a stiff-looking bed. A tiny bathroom with a toilet and a rusty shower head. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. That was the whole point, I reminded myself. I started a fire in the wood stove. There was a stack of firewood outside, dry enough to catch. The heat spread slowly, and I sat in front of it for a long time, just listening to the crackling and watching the shadows move across the walls. I ate a can of chili I'd brought with me, then unpacked and got ready for bed. The first night passed without anything unusual. I fell asleep early and woke up once to the sound of wind outside, but it wasn't too bad. I pulled the blanket tighter and went back to sleep. The second day I spent walking around. There was an old trail behind the cabin that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It led into the forest and curved out of sight. I followed it for maybe a mile before I realized how easy it would be to get lost if I wasn't careful. The trees looked the same in every direction, and I hadn't brought anything to mark my way. I turned back, noticing how quiet everything was. Not even birds, just the sound of leaves crunching under my boots and the occasional creak of a tree swaying. Back at the cabin, I chopped some more firewood. I cooked pasta on the small gas stove and sat by the window while I ate. The sky was turning gray, thick clouds rolling in. I could hear branches tapping against the roof. The wind had picked up. I checked my phone again. Still no service. I put it away and tried to read a book, but I couldn't concentrate. That night, something woke me up. I don't know what it was exactly. A sound maybe, or just a bad feeling. I sat up in bed, heart beating hard. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow from the stove in the other room. I didn't hear anything at first, just the wind. Then something creaked outside. Not the regular groaning of wood in the wind. This was different. A sharp sound, like a footstep on the porch. I sat there, holding my breath, staring at the bedroom door. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. Nothing. I finally got up, careful not to make noise. I moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. Couldn't see much, just dark trees and falling leaves moving in the wind. But I thought I saw something shift near the edge of the woods. A shape, could have been a shadow or maybe an animal. I stayed there for a while, eyes locked on that spot, but nothing moved again. In the morning, I went outside to check. The porch was wet from the rain, and there were leaves scattered all over, but something caught my eye. Partial footprint in the mud. Not deep, but it looked fresh. Too big for an animal, too clear to be from yesterday. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I walked around the cabin, looking for anything else. Nothing. No broken windows, no signs of anyone nearby. Just that one footprint. I told myself it was probably mine from the day before, that I'd stepped there while unloading the firewood. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent most of that day indoors. The wind had picked up, and the sky stayed dark. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, something thudding lightly against the back wall of the cabin. Every time I went to look, there was nothing there. I kept the fire going and locked the door. That night, it was worse. Couldn't sleep. The wind was howling, and it sounded like something was moving around the cabin. I sat up, wide awake, blanket around me, staring at the shadows on the wall. Then I heard the sound again. The porch creaked. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. I got up, heart pounding, and grabbed the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood. I held it tight and walked toward the door. I didn't open it, just stood there listening. I thought I heard breathing. Then it stopped. Everything went silent again. I stayed there for what felt like hours, afraid to move. In the morning, I checked again. No new footprints, no broken window, but something had been moved. The stack of firewood I'd built up on the side of the cabin was knocked over. Not fallen from the wind, it looked like someone had pushed it. Some of the logs were scattered far away, as if tossed. That was it. I decided I was leaving the next day. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed most of my stuff before it even got dark. I kept the hatchet close. I didn't light a fire. I sat in the cold, back against the wall, facing the door. Late that night, just past midnight, I heard the crunch of leaves outside, then slow steps on the porch. The doorknob jiggled. I held my breath, clutching the hatchet so hard my hand hurt. The door creaked a little but held. The person, whoever it was, walked around to the side of the cabin. I heard more noises, like they were dragging something, then quiet again. I stayed frozen until morning. When the light finally came through the windows, I went outside. On the porch, I found deep scratches on the door, as if someone had dragged a metal object across it. A piece of thick wire was left hanging from the handle. The firewood was scattered again. But what made me pack my stuff and leave without eating, without checking the rest, was the boot print on the windowsill. Someone had climbed up and tried to look inside. I drove away fast, barely checking the road. My hands were shaking. My clothes were damp from sweat. When I finally hit paved road and got a few bars of signal, I pulled over and called the police. I told them everything. They said they'd send someone to check, but there wasn't much they could do. No real damage, no proof of trespassing, just marks and stories. But they agreed to look into it. I never went back to that cabin. I never even got my deposit back. I looked online a week later and the listing was gone. I tried to trace the owner's email, but it bounced. The number I'd been given didn't work anymore. I don't know who or what was out there those nights, but it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone was watching me, testing the locks, moving things, waiting. I don't stay in remote cabins anymore. Not alone. I don't even go camping. That trip changed something in me, made me realize how far away help really is when you're out in the woods. How easily someone could slip through the trees, stand just outside your window, and you'd never even know they were there. It started with a plan to get away from everything. Work had been dragging me down for months. My back hurt from sitting all day, my head ached from staring at a screen, and my patience was worn thin from endless deadlines. I wanted quiet. I wanted trees and the smell of wood and fresh air. So I booked a cabin up in the hills, one I found listed on a small site that rented out isolated places. It was supposed to be peaceful, no neighbors, no cell signal, just me and the forest. The drive out took longer than expected. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then gravel to dirt. Branches scraped against the side of my car, and potholes forced me to crawl along at a snail's pace. I started to wonder if I made the right decision, but by the time I saw the cabin through the trees, I was too far in to turn back. It looked decent enough. Wood exterior, small porch, a stack of firewood neatly arranged beside it. The clearing it sat in wasn't very big, but it was surrounded on all sides by thick trees. I could barely hear the wind through them. Inside, it smelled like cedar and dust. The floors creaked when I walked. There was no TV, no radio, and the kitchen had a tiny gas stove and an old fridge that rattled when it ran. The bathroom was small but clean, and the bed had heavy blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs. I unpacked and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the nothing outside. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The first day passed quietly. I made some food, walked around the woods nearby, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The light filtered through the trees in a way that made the whole place glow orange. I watched squirrels run through the branches and heard the distant sound of birds settling in for the night. When it got dark, really dark, I lit some candles and read a book I brought with me. There were no cars, no neighbors, no distractions. I slept deeply that night. It was the second day when I noticed something odd. While walking a narrow trail behind the cabin, I came across what looked like an old, rusted shovel sticking out of the ground. Just the handle was visible. It looked like it had been there for years. Curiosity got the better of me and I pulled at it. It didn't move. The dirt around it was packed tight, almost like someone had filled it in not long ago. I left it alone. It wasn't mine to mess with. That night, I heard something outside. It was faint, branches snapping, maybe, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. I sat up in bed and listened. The noise came again. It sounded like something heavy moving slowly through the trees. I stayed in bed, telling myself it was a deer or maybe a bear. Nothing unusual for the woods. But my heart wouldn't slow down, and I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to check. I didn't see anything at first, but a few feet into the woods, I found footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. The ground was soft from rain a few days before, and the prints were clear. Human, definitely. They weren't big, but they were wide, and the toes looked thick. The steps were deep, like whoever made them was heavy. They circled the cabin, then disappeared into the trees. I stood there staring at them for a long time. I should have left, but I didn't. I told myself someone might have passed by during the night and didn't mean any harm. Maybe it was a hunter or someone camping nearby, but deep down it didn't feel right. I went back inside and locked the door. That day passed slowly. I stayed close to the cabin, never straying far from the porch. Every little sound made me jump. The woods, which felt calming before, now felt thick and closed in. I kept thinking about those footprints, how fresh they looked. I watched the woods until my eyes hurt. That night, I barely slept. I heard the noises again. This time, they were closer. Something brushed the side of the cabin. Something big. The sound of breathing, almost. I held my breath. Then I heard slow steps on the porch. I lay frozen, not even blinking. The steps stopped right outside the door. I stared at it, waiting, heart hammering. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, the steps moved away. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I checked the porch. More prints, clearer this time. The same wide feet. They led around the cabin again, and this time I saw where they had come from. Down a hill behind the cabin, deeper into the woods. I thought about following them, but something stopped me. My gut told me not to go down there. I made up my mind to leave. I packed quickly, barely ate. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over. The dashboard stayed dark. I checked the battery cables. They looked fine. Tried again. Nothing. I was stuck. The nearest town was miles away, and I didn't have a signal to call for help. I locked myself in the cabin that night, pushed a chair under the doorknob, kept a fire going in the fireplace, even though it was warm. The light made me feel a little safer, but the noises came again. The slow steps, the breathing, the tapping on the window. It didn't stop. It circled the cabin over and over. It never tried the door, just made sure I knew it was out there. I sat up all night, a kitchen knife in my hand, shaking, too afraid to sleep. By morning, the fire had died, and my hands were sore from gripping the knife. I didn't go outside. I stayed in the cabin all day, curtains drawn, waiting. I drank the last of my water and ate a can of beans cold. Every sound made me jump. I kept thinking about those footprints, how they circled the cabin like someone was watching, or waiting. The fourth night was worse. I heard more than one set of footsteps, 2, maybe 3, moving in different directions, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Something scratched at the walls. I thought I heard something breathe just outside my window. I tried to sleep on the floor in the center of the room where I couldn't be seen, but the sounds never stopped. Every time I dozed off, a thud or scrape woke me up again. I made it through the night, barely. I had to get out. I decided to walk. I packed a small bag, took the knife, and left the cabin just after sunrise. I followed the dirt road, heart pounding with every step. The woods felt alive around me, too quiet. I kept checking behind me. After 2 hours of walking, I finally got a signal on my phone. I called for help. A ranger picked me up an hour later. I didn't tell him everything, just said my car broke down and I needed to get to town. He looked at me like he knew I wasn't telling the full story, but he didn't ask questions. Back home, I looked up the area around the cabin, found a couple of old news articles. There were mentions of missing people in that region. Hikers, campers, nothing recent, no details. I never found out who or what was watching me out there. I never figured out who left those footprints, and I didn't go back to find out. I sold my car, took a break from work. I can't sleep unless every door and window is locked. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sounds, scratching, slow steps on wooden boards, breathing in the dark. But I know it's in my head. At least I hope it is. I've never gone back to the woods. I never will. It started with a break from everything. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, and stuck in the same daily cycle that made each day blend into the next. I needed to get away from the noise, from people, from the phone that wouldn't stop ringing. I found a cabin listed on an old travel site, buried between ads and badly written reviews. It didn't have many pictures, just a few shots of a small wooden structure in the woods. The listing said it was deep in northern Minnesota, off an unpaved road, and completely isolated. No power, no cell service, no distractions. It sounded perfect. I packed light, a few days worth of food, a first aid kit, a sleeping bag, a knife, a flashlight with extra batteries, a paper map, and some matches. I didn't expect anything dramatic. I was just planning to rest, maybe fish a little in the nearby river, read a book, and reset my head. I told one friend the rough location just in case and took off early in the morning. The drive up was long. Paved roads turned to gravel, then gravel turned into dirt paths full of potholes. I kept checking the map against road signs nailed to trees, but there weren't many. At one point, I almost turned around when a fallen tree blocked the road, but I managed to drive around it through the edge of the woods. After another hour, I finally found the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. Just one room with a slanted tin roof and a tiny porch out front. The wood was weathered and gray. There was a metal chimney sticking out from the top, probably from a wood stove inside. The place looked abandoned, but the lock on the front door was new. I used the key the owner had mailed me, stepped inside, and took a breath. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been opened in a while. The inside was basic. A small cot in the corner, a table and chair by the window, and a black wood stove near the center. No running water. A few pots and pans hanging from hooks on the wall. There was a cooler in the corner and a stack of chopped wood outside. It was just what I needed. Nothing extra, nothing modern. The first day passed peacefully. I unloaded my stuff, swept the place out, made a small fire in the stove, and sat outside until the sun went down. The woods were quiet. No cars, no voices, no distant planes overhead. Just wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up early, made some instant coffee over the stove, then walked down the slope behind the cabin to find the river. It wasn't far, maybe a 10-minute walk through a narrow trail lined with tall pine and birch trees. The river was slow and wide, with clear water and large stones scattered along the banks. I sat there for an hour just watching the water. Around noon, I decided to explore further. I marked the trail back with some broken branches and walked upstream. I didn't plan to go far, but the forest had a strange pull. Every turn made me want to see what was around the next bend. Eventually, I found a small clearing where the trees opened to a mossy patch of ground. In the middle of it, there was an old fire ring made of stones. I thought maybe hunters or campers had used it. I looked around for any sign of people but didn't find trash, footprints, or gear. On my way back, I took a wrong turn. The woods looked different in the afternoon light, and the markers I had made weren't as clear coming from the other side. I walked in circles for almost an hour before I found my trail again. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sun was low. I made a fire, ate a simple meal, and read until dark. That night, something woke me up. At first, I thought it was the wind. The cabin creaked, and the trees outside groaned. But then I heard a thump, not like something falling, more like a heavy step on the porch. I froze in my sleeping bag. There were no lights to turn on, no phone to call for help. I waited, listening. Another thump, then nothing. I sat still for almost 30 minutes, staring at the door. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal, a deer, maybe a bear sniffing around. I didn't open the door. I just stayed awake until the sky began to turn light. The next morning, I checked outside. The porch had some scratches near the step, long ones like claws or maybe from a branch. I wasn't sure. There were no clear tracks on the ground, just disturbed dirt. Still, I felt uneasy. I made sure my knife was sharp and kept it on me for the rest of the day. The third day was colder. Clouds rolled in by noon, and a light rain started falling. I stayed inside, reading and writing in a small journal I had brought. Every little sound outside seemed louder. I kept thinking about the noise the night before, kept checking the window. That night, it happened again. Thump, then a scraping sound against the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I sat on the cot with the knife in my hand and my back against the wall. The sound moved around the cabin slowly, like something circling. Then silence. In the morning, I found more marks. Deep gouges in the wood under the window. Something had definitely been there. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't wind. Something had walked around the cabin, scratched the wall, touched the window. That day, I made a plan to leave early. I had enough gas to make it to town, and I didn't want to stay another night. But as I packed, I realized I hadn't seen my map. I had left it on the table, but it was gone. I searched everywhere, under the cot, in my bags, on the porch. It was just gone. I still knew the road I came in on, but without the map, I wasn't sure how many turns there were. I thought about driving anyway, but it started raining harder by afternoon, and the dirt road would be muddy and hard to drive on. I decided to wait one more day, one more night. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove with the fire low, knife in hand, flashlight nearby. The rain beat down on the roof. The trees swayed and groaned. Then, around 2 in the morning, the sound came back. Thump, but this time it was louder. I pointed the flashlight at the door. Shadows moved through the cracks. I stood slowly, listening. The door rattled. Not violently, just a single shake, like someone testing it. Then silence. I stayed standing until the sun rose. When I opened the door in the morning, everything looked normal. No tracks, no marks, but the feeling hadn't left. Something had been out there. I didn't care about the rain. I packed everything and left. The drive was rough. The road was thick with mud, and the tires slipped more than once. At one point, I thought I was stuck for good, but I kept the wheels turning and managed to crawl forward. It took hours to reach a real road. When I made it back to town, I felt like I could breathe again. I checked into a cheap motel, took a long shower, and slept with the lights on. A week later, I got a call from the friend I told about the trip. They asked how it went. I told them it was fine, just quiet and rainy. I didn't mention the noises or the scratches or the missing map. A few days after that, I got a package in the mail. No return address, no note. Inside was my map, folded neatly, with new red markings along the trail. That was the last time I went to the woods alone. It was early October when I decided to take some time off and head into the woods. I had been working long hours at my job in the city, and everything was starting to feel like a blur. Wake up, sit in traffic, stare at screens, go home, repeat. I felt like I hadn't had a clear thought in months, so I rented this old wooden cabin deep in the forest of northern Michigan. It wasn't listed on any major site. I found it through a small, outdated blog someone had made years ago about off-grid stays. There was no running water, no electricity, and the road to get there was just a narrow dirt path that curved through dense trees. I packed my SUV with all the essentials: food, extra clothes, 2 coolers filled with ice and meat, canned goods, a large water jug, a camping stove, batteries, lanterns, a first aid kit, some tools, and a couple of thick blankets. I also brought a hunting knife, a small axe, and an old .22 rifle that had been sitting in my dad's garage for years. I wasn't expecting trouble, but it made me feel better just having them. The drive took about 9 hours. The further I got from civilization, the more silent everything became. The trees were changing color, bright reds and oranges mixed in with dark evergreens. The last 30 minutes of the drive were the roughest. The dirt road was full of potholes, and I had to drive slowly so I wouldn't blow a tire. There were no signs, no cell signal, and the trees formed a kind of tunnel that made it feel like the road could vanish at any second. When I finally saw the cabin, I stopped the car and just sat there for a minute. It was small, probably no bigger than 20 by 20 feet. The wood was weathered and gray, with patches of moss creeping up from the foundation. The roof looked stable enough, and there was a small porch with a single wooden chair. The windows were clouded over and crooked in their frames. I could tell no one had been there in a long time. I stepped out and stretched. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Everything was still. There wasn't even a breeze. I unlocked the cabin door using the key the owner had mailed me, and it creaked open slowly. Inside was as simple as you'd expect. A bed frame with a thin mattress, a small table and chair, a wood stove in the corner, a few shelves, and an old trunk that sat at the foot of the bed. The floorboards groaned under my feet. There was dust everywhere, but otherwise it felt solid and safe. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned chili on the stove, read a book under my lantern's yellow light, and went to bed early. The sounds of the forest were loud at first, but they eventually faded into the background. I slept better than I had in weeks. On the second day, I chopped firewood, explored the trails behind the cabin, and made notes in a journal. I felt good. It was like I had escaped the world completely. Around dusk, I heard something in the distance. It sounded like metal banging on metal. It echoed faintly through the trees but didn't last long. I figured maybe it was an animal knocking something over. I didn't think much of it. On the third night, something changed. It was close to midnight when I heard footsteps outside. Slow, heavy ones. At first, I thought it was a deer, but then they stopped right outside the window by my bed. I sat up quietly and turned off the lantern. The cabin went dark. I listened. The steps moved again, circling the cabin. Each footfall was distinct, not rushed but not careful either, just steady, confident. Then they stopped again. I held my breath. My rifle was under the bed. I reached down slowly and grabbed it, keeping my eyes on the window, but nothing moved. I didn't hear any breathing, no animal sounds, just silence. I waited for what felt like an hour, staring into the black window pane, but saw nothing. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up, rifle across my lap. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. No prints. The ground was hard-packed dirt and leaves, so maybe they didn't leave a mark. Still, something about it didn't sit right. I kept the rifle close that day. I stayed near the cabin, only venturing a little down the trail to gather firewood. The forest felt different, quieter, like something was holding its breath. That night, I set up some makeshift tripwires using fishing line and a few empty cans. I stretched them low across the porch and the path leading to the back of the cabin. I didn't know if they'd actually do much, but it gave me a bit of peace of mind. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of cans rattling. My heart jumped. I sat up fast, grabbed the rifle, and aimed it at the front door. My lantern was already lit, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. I waited, ears straining. I heard nothing else. No footsteps this time. When morning came, I stepped outside and saw that the tripwire on the porch had been tripped. One of the cans had rolled off the edge, but there were no signs of what had triggered it. I scanned the woods for movement, but everything looked normal. I picked up the can and reset the wire. Something was definitely out there. The next 2 days were tense. I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept the fire going longer than usual and moved the bed closer to the wood stove for warmth. On the 6th day, I found something hanging on the doorknob when I came back from gathering wood. A single rusted key. It hadn't been there when I left. It was cold to the touch, even though the sun had been out all day. I looked around quickly, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing, just the quiet rustle of wind through the leaves. I didn't know what to do with the key, so I placed it in the trunk at the foot of the bed and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. The 7th night, I heard the cans rattle again. Then a knock on the door. Not loud, just a slow, deliberate knock. Then another. Then silence. I didn't move. My lantern was off. I sat there in the dark, holding the rifle, listening. Nothing else happened. No footsteps walking away. No more knocks. Just that stillness again. In the morning, I opened the door and saw a set of muddy footprints. Bare feet. They led from the trees to the porch and stopped at the door. Then nothing. No return trail. Just one direction. I decided I had enough. I packed everything I could fit in the car and left that afternoon. The road was even rougher going back. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the road, but no one was there. When I got back home, I unpacked and opened the trunk I'd brought with me. I had forgotten I had placed the old key inside it, but it wasn't there anymore. I searched everything, every bag, every box. The key was gone. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about the trip. I stopped telling people about it because no one really had anything to say. It just made me sound paranoid. But sometimes, late at night, I still wake up and think I hear those same slow footsteps outside my window. Just steady, confident, and I keep the rifle close because I never did find out who was in those woods with me or what they wanted, and I don't think I ever will. It started with a need for peace. I'd been living in the city for too long. The noise, the traffic, the constant buzz of people. It wore me down slowly. I hadn't realized how much it had drained me until one morning. I found myself sitting in my kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. I couldn't remember if I'd already drunk from it or not. That scared me more than anything. I needed a break. I needed to go somewhere quiet, away from everything. A friend of mine had a cabin up north, in a thick patch of woods that backed up against a shallow river. It was about a 5-hour drive from the city. He didn't use it much anymore and offered me the keys without hesitation. I packed lightly, a duffel bag with clothes, a cooler with food, a couple of books, and my hunting knife. More for comfort than anything else. I had no plans to hunt, but I'd always brought it along on past trips. It was like a ritual. The drive up was smooth, and the deeper I got into the wilderness, the more relaxed I started to feel. The paved roads turned into gravel, then dirt. Trees closed in on both sides. I lost cell signal about an hour from the cabin. That didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. I wanted to disappear for a while. The cabin sat in a small clearing, about 20 yards from the riverbank. It was old but solid, built from thick timber, with a tin roof and a wide front porch that creaked under my boots as I stepped onto it. Inside, it was simple: one bedroom, a kitchen, a living area with a wood-burning stove, and a bathroom with running water from a well. No electricity, just oil lamps and a fireplace. That first night, I sat outside on the porch, Watching the river flow and listening to the wind move through the trees felt like a different world. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked a little, read by the fire, cooked simple meals, and slept better than I had in months. On the third day, I decided to follow the river upstream. It wasn't something I'd planned. I just woke up, ate breakfast, and started walking. There wasn't a clear trail, but the forest was sparse enough that I could make my way without too much trouble. I followed the water for maybe 2 hours, stopping occasionally to rest or take in the view. Around noon, I found a narrow path that led away from the river and deeper into the woods. It was barely visible, just a break in the undergrowth. I don't know why I decided to follow it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the stillness in the air that made me think something was hidden out there. The trail wound through dense trees and uneven ground. Climbed gently, and I noticed the air getting cooler. After maybe 20 minutes of walking, I came upon a second cabin. This one was smaller and looked much older. The roof sagged in the middle, and the front steps were half buried in leaves and dirt. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly open. I stopped a few feet away, studying it. It didn't feel right. Something about it made my skin crawl. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the forest seemed to go quiet around it. No birds, no insects, just the wind, and even that seemed distant. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I stepped onto the porch, which groaned under my weight. The door creaked open with a light push. Inside, it was dark and musty. Dust hung in the air, and I could see the shapes of old furniture, what looked like a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed frame. Everything was coated in grime. I didn't go far inside. I just stood there for a moment, looking around, heart beating faster for no good reason. Then I left. Back at my cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see something moving through the trees. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing sounds outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Once or twice, I thought I heard footsteps. Not animal sounds, something heavier, slower. I told myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me, but I locked the door and kept the knife close. The next morning, I found footprints near the porch. Bare footprints. Human. They weren't mine. They led from the woods to the front steps and then back again. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the underbrush. I spent the rest of the day close to the cabin, uneasy. I kept the fire going even during the day, just to make the place feel warmer, safer. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard a knock on the door. Just one, slow and heavy. I froze. The fire was still burning low, casting shadows across the room. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Whoever or whatever was outside didn't knock again. They just stood there. I could feel it. I didn't dare look through the window. I waited like that for hours, heart pounding, every muscle tight. When the sun rose, I opened the door. Nothing. No one. But the footprints were there again. Closer this time. Right up against the door. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't want to walk through the woods with someone, or something, out there. I stayed one more night, not because I wanted to, but because I was too scared to leave during the day. I couldn't explain it. I felt like if I turned my back to the woods, something would follow me. I kept the knife in my hand all night, sat by the fire, and waited. No knock this time, but I heard something breathing outside. Slow, steady breaths, right by the window. I didn't move. The next morning, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't even drink water. I just grabbed my stuff, threw it in the car, and left. The drive back to the city felt like waking up from a nightmare. Every mile that passed, I felt a little lighter, but I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to my friend's place, the one who owned the cabin. I gave him the keys and told him I wouldn't be going back. I didn't explain why. I just told him he should probably sell it, or burn it. It's been months since then. I haven't gone near the woods again. I don't go hiking, don't go camping. I even moved to a smaller apartment just to stay closer to the city center. Somewhere with people, with noise, with lights. Somewhere where I can see who's coming and going. Sometimes at night, I still hear that knock. Just one. In my head, clear as day. I don't answer it. Started with a break. That was all I wanted. A few days away from the noise, the work, the people. I had booked a small, old cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no electricity. Just a gas stove, a hand pump for water, and an old fireplace. It sounded like the kind of quiet I hadn't had in years. I wanted to hike, read, and sit in silence. That was it. I drove up in early October. The leaves were already turning, a slow blanket of gold and red covering the back roads. My car was filled with canned food, firewood, a flashlight, extra batteries, a good knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought an old sleeping bag and a thick wool blanket. Nights were already dropping near freezing. The last stretch to the cabin wasn't paved. It was a single-lane dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. Branches scratched the sides as I crept forward. My GPS stopped working about 20 minutes before I reached the gate. It was an old wooden gate with rusted hinges and a chain looped around one post. No lock, just a warning nailed to the gate. Enter at your own risk. Private property. That didn't worry me. The warning was probably just a leftover from whoever owned the land before. I had rented it legally through a website, and the owner messaged me the directions and key code. I opened the gate and drove slowly toward the cabin. It was small, not run down, but definitely old. The wooden siding was gray from weather and time. The roof had moss growing on one side. The front porch sagged in the middle, and the door had 3 deep scratches across it, probably from an animal. I parked my car beside the cabin and stepped out. The air was cold and sharp. It smelled like wet leaves and pine. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood there for a while. It was one open room with a small kitchenette to the left and a cot to the right. A wooden table sat in the middle. No chairs, just a bench on one side. There were 2 small windows, one in front and one in the back, and a single oil lantern hanging from the ceiling. I unpacked slowly, put the food on the shelves, set the firewood by the fireplace, and rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the clearing. There was an old outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin, half hidden by trees. A narrow trail led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while but turned back after 20 minutes. The trees grew thick quickly, and the light faded fast. That night, I built a fire and cooked a can of chili on the stove. I sat at the table and ate in silence. The only sound was the wind outside and the occasional creak of the cabin. I read by flashlight until I got tired, then crawled into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep well. The wind howled most of the night, and something scratched at the wall once. I told myself it was a raccoon or maybe a branch. The next morning, I woke up early. My back hurt from the thin cot, and my toes were cold. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside. It was quiet, too quiet. I stood still for a long time, holding the mug in both hands. No birds, no bugs, just the wind again. I went for a hike that day, followed the trail deeper than before. The trees closed in around me. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of moss and rot. I marked trees as I went, carving a small line with my knife every few hundred feet. I didn't want to get lost. After a couple hours, I stopped to eat, sat on a log, drank some water, ate a granola bar. That's when I noticed it. Another mark, like mine but different. Not fresh, old but not too old. A symbol, not just a line. A triangle with a line through it, carved deep into the bark of a tree just a few feet from mine. I stared at it for a while. I didn't like it. It looked deliberate, maybe even angry. I stood up and headed back. I walked faster than I had before. I kept looking over my shoulder. The trail felt different on the way back. Heavier, darker, like the trees were leaning in, watching. I found all my marks, one after the other, until I got to the clearing. My car was still there. The cabin looked the same, but something felt off. Couldn't place it. Inside, I lit the lantern and sat by the fire. I kept thinking about that symbol. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything, just some old marking, maybe a hunter, maybe someone else used this place before. I kept telling myself that until I believed it enough to go to sleep. That night, I woke up to a sound. A thump, then another, came from the back wall. I sat up slowly. My flashlight was on the table just out of reach. I waited. Another thump, then a scraping noise, like something dragging across wood. I grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on. Nothing inside the cabin. I stood up and pointed the beam at the window. Nothing, just trees. I didn't sleep again. I sat by the fire until it died down, then wrapped myself in the blanket and watched the door. Morning came slow. Gray light through the window, cold air. My throat was dry and my legs ached. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. On the back wall, just under the window, were scratches. Deep ones. Not animal, not random. For lines almost straight, spaced apart evenly. I packed my stuff. I was ready to leave. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. I just wanted to get back on the road. I threw everything into the car and got in. The engine started, but the wheels spun. The ground had turned soft from the rain overnight. My tires sank into the mud. I tried again. Same thing. I got out, grabbed a piece of firewood, and shoved it under the tires. No luck. The car wouldn't move. I gave up and went back inside. I had enough food for another day. I could wait for the ground to dry. That was the plan. Just wait. I locked the door, pulled the bench in front of it, and sat down. I watched the woods through the window. I stayed like that for hours. Started again that night. Thumps, scratches, closer, louder. I didn't sleep at all. I sat with the knife in my hand, listening. Just before dawn, I thought I saw something through the window, a shape too tall for an animal. It moved between the trees, slow and steady. I didn't move until it was fully light. When I went outside, I found more marks on the wall. Same pattern. For lines, deeper this time, and boot prints in the mud. Not mine. Bigger, heavier. I followed them a few feet, but they disappeared into the trees. That day, I stayed close. I carried the knife everywhere. I kept the flashlight in my pocket. I waited. I listened. I thought about trying the car again, but I was afraid of being out there too long. I didn't know who was out there. That night was the worst. The door rattled. Not the wind. Something pulled at it. I could hear the wood groan. I held the knife and stood behind the table. The lantern flickered. Then I heard the window. Tap. Then another. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. After a while, it stopped. The first light, I ran to the car. The ground had hardened just enough. I got in and backed up slowly. The tires caught and I made it onto the path. I didn't stop to close the gate. I just kept driving until I reached the highway. I didn't look back. Later, when I got home, I tried to find something about the place. I looked up the owner. The website was gone. The contact email didn't work. The listing vanished like it had never existed. I even searched county records. The land hadn't been registered to anyone in years. I still think about the cabin. I still hear the scratching sometimes when I'm trying to sleep. I haven't gone back into the woods since, and I never will. It was the fall of 2019 when I decided to take a break from everything. Life had been too loud lately. I was tired of the traffic, the noise, the phone constantly buzzing, and people always around. I just needed silence. I had a week off from work, and I thought it was the right time to go somewhere far and quiet, somewhere no one would bother me. I searched around and found an old cabin listed for rent on a small website. It was deep in the woods, in a place called Miller Ridge in northern Idaho. The pictures looked plain. An old wooden cabin surrounded by dense trees, a dirt path, no visible neighbors, and a small lake nearby. It seemed perfect. The drive there took nearly 9 hours. The last hour was all narrow dirt roads that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. My car bounced and groaned with every pothole. As I got deeper into the forest, cell signal dropped completely. There were no signs, no houses, no fences. Just trees, rocks, and dead leaves. The cabin was even more worn down than the pictures. The wood was faded gray, the roof looked slanted, and some of the windows had cracks in them. There were no lights outside, no porch lamp, no welcome mat, just a single metal key left in a lockbox. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old paper. The furniture looked like it hadn't been sat on in years. A couch with springs poking out, a wooden table with deep scratches, and dusty books on a shelf that tilted sideways. There was no power. The listing had said so. The cabin had a small generator in the back, and I had brought enough fuel to keep it running at night. There was also an old cast iron stove for heat and a gas burner for cooking. Water came from a hand pump outside. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, stacked firewood, checked the doors and windows, and explored the area a little. The trees were thick and the paths weren't really paths, just flattened areas where maybe animals had passed. I didn't go far. I didn't need to. I wanted to stay close. That night, I sat by the fire, ate some canned soup, read a few pages from an old book I brought, and went to sleep early. But the second night, something felt different. It started with a noise. I was in bed, listening to the sounds outside. The forest is loud in its own way. Leaves rustling, branches cracking, insects chirping, and sometimes distant animal calls. But this noise was different. It was a dull thud, not loud, just noticeable. I sat up, came again, a thump, then another, slow, almost like footsteps, but heavier. I turned off the small battery-powered lamp beside the bed. I sat there in silence, holding my breath. The thudding stopped. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Nothing. I lay back down, heart still racing. Maybe it was a deer, or something fell from a tree. I told myself that and tried to sleep again. I did eventually, but it was light, uncomfortable sleep. The next day, I looked around outside. Nothing seemed out of place. No prints. No marks on the door or windows. Everything looked the same. Still, I decided to keep the hatchet close that night, just in case. The third night is when things got worse. Again, I heard the sound. This time it was earlier, right after I turned off the generator. Thump, then another. It was closer this time, not coming from the woods. It sounded like it was right outside the cabin. I sat still, barely breathing. The sound stopped for a few minutes. Then I heard what I can only describe as light scraping, like something dragging across wood. I crept to the window and looked out. It was dark, pitch black. My flashlight was beside the bed, but I didn't want to turn it on. My eyes slowly adjusted. Then I saw it, a shape, not clear, just darker than the rest. Maybe 10 feet away, near the trees. It didn't move. I stared at it for what felt like forever. Eventually, I backed away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner, hatchet in hand, eyes on the door. Morning came slow. When the light finally started breaking through the trees, I went out and checked again. There were marks on the porch. Long, thin lines, not like animal claws. More like a stick had been dragged back and forth across the wood. I thought about leaving. I packed some things and even started the car. But I stopped. I told myself I was being stupid. Maybe it was a raccoon. Maybe I imagined the shape. I had come here to be alone. I wasn't going to leave because of a few noises, but I should have. The fourth day was quiet. I hiked a little farther into the woods, trying to find signs of any nearby cabins or trails. Nothing, just trees and hills and dead leaves. When I got back, I saw something strange. The door was open, just slightly. I was sure I had locked it. Inside, everything looked the same except for the couch. It had been moved. Not a lot, just a few inches, but enough that I noticed. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. That night, I didn't turn off the generator. I kept the lights on. I didn't care about the fuel. I sat up all night again, holding the hatchet. I heard the noises again. This time, they were sharper. A knock, a scraping, then silence. Around 3 a.m., the lights flickered. The generator was running low. I got up, grabbed the fuel can, and went out the back. I kept the flashlight off. I didn't want to draw attention. As I walked around the cabin, I heard movement. Quick, soft steps. I froze. Then I turned the flashlight on and pointed it at the woods. Nothing, but I didn't feel alone. My skin crawled. I filled the generator as fast as I could and rushed back in, locking the door behind me. The fifth morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints, human footprints, bare feet. They were all around the cabin. Some led to the woods, some to the lake, some just circled the cabin again and again. I lost it then. I threw everything into the car. I didn't care if I left food behind. I didn't even care if the cabin owner kept the deposit. I had to leave. The drive back was terrifying. I kept checking the mirror. Every bump on the road felt like something chasing me. When I got to the main road and my signal came back, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I never reported it. What would I even say? I didn't have proof, just a story. And who would believe it? It's been years now. I never went back. I've never even been near woods again. I still wake up some nights, thinking I hear footsteps or scraping sounds outside my window. Sometimes I wonder if it was just a person. Maybe someone who lived out there. Maybe they didn't like me being there. Maybe it was their way of telling me to leave. Or maybe they were waiting for something worse. I'll never know, and I don't want to. All I know is that I left that place, and I never felt safe in silence again. It was late October when I decided to spend a full week alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Minnesota. I had been feeling burned out from work and city life, and I thought a quiet place in the woods would help me reset. The cabin was about 30 miles from the nearest town, and the last few miles of road were just rough dirt paths through thick pine forests. My uncle hadn't used the place in years. He moved out of state, but he gave me a spare key and told me I was welcome to use it whenever I wanted. When I pulled up that first day, it was just past noon. The air was cool and the sky was clear. The cabin sat in a small clearing, with trees pressing in on all sides. The building was a single-story wooden structure with a slanted tin roof and a small front porch. There was no running water and no electricity, just a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen with a propane stove, and a kerosene lantern for light. Inside, it smelled of dry wood, old dust, and something like old leather. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it was solid. A little run down, but nothing I couldn't handle. I spent that first afternoon cleaning up, unpacking my gear, and getting the place warmed up. I brought in firewood from the stack out back, set up my sleeping bag on the cot in the corner, and made a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. That night was peaceful. I sat outside for a while, listening to the wind in the trees and the sound of distant owls. I hadn't felt that calm in months. With no cell signal and no internet, I was truly alone, and it felt good. The second day, I hiked around the area. There was a trail leading from the back of the cabin into the woods. My uncle had told me it went about 2 miles and ended at a small lake. I took my time walking it, listening to birds and watching for signs of wildlife. I saw a few deer and some rabbit tracks. When I reached the lake, it was even quieter than the forest. The surface of the water was smooth like glass, and the only sound was the wind. I sat there for a while before heading back. That evening, I noticed something strange. When I got back to the cabin, the back door was open. I knew I had locked it when I left. I was sure of it, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe I had closed it but forgot to turn the lock all the way. I checked inside, and nothing looked touched or moved. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and tried to shake the feeling. The third day, I stayed around the cabin. I did some reading, chopped more firewood, and fixed one of the window shutters that had come loose. Everything seemed normal again. But that night, I woke up around 2 a.m. There was a sound outside, not loud but steady, a kind of rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was branches hitting the roof. But when I sat up and listened, it was coming from the back of the cabin, near the door. I got up slowly, my heart pounding, and went to the window. It was too dark to see anything, so I grabbed the lantern and stepped outside. The air was freezing, and the trees were still. I walked around the cabin, light in hand, but saw nothing. No animals, no branches moving, nothing that would make that sound. Still, I couldn't ignore how real it had felt. The next morning, I checked the area behind the cabin again. The dirt was hard-packed, but I found what looked like boot prints. They weren't mine. I had been wearing hiking boots with a very specific tread, and these prints were different. They were older looking, worn flat, and headed toward the woods. I followed them a short way before they disappeared into underbrush. That whole day, I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about those prints. I tried to read and eat, but I kept glancing at the windows. I locked the doors early that night and moved a chair in front of the back door, just in case. I even kept the hatchet next to my cot. I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I heard a single knock on the back door. Just one. It was loud and clear. I froze, not even breathing. The knock didn't come again. I waited for almost an hour, sitting in the dark with the hatchet in my hands. Nothing else happened. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my gear and planned to head back to my truck, drive into town, and just go home. But when I got outside, I saw something that made my stomach turn. On the front porch, nailed to one of the support beams, was a small strip of cloth. It looked like it had come from a jacket, a faded blue color with a tear through the middle. I didn't own anything like it. That confirmed it for me. Someone had been out there, watching me. Maybe they had been living out in the woods, maybe they were just passing through, but they had come close enough to leave something on the porch. I didn't want to know what they wanted. I grabbed my things, got in the truck, and started down the trail. The dirt road was rough and I took it slow. After about 5 minutes of driving, I noticed something else. A pile of small rocks had been stacked in the middle of the road, neatly placed like a marker. I got out, kicked them aside, and kept going. My heart was racing the whole time. Once I got back to town, I stopped at a diner and sat there for an hour just to be around people. I kept thinking about how quiet those woods were, how easy it would be for someone to hide out there and watch, to slip in and out without being seen. I never went back to that cabin. I told my uncle what happened, and he said the area had always been remote, but nothing like that had ever happened to him. Still, I left the key with him and said he could keep it. That trip stayed with me. The idea that someone could have been just outside, watching me, maybe waiting for something, haunted me more than any story. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was real. Someone had been there. Someone knew I was alone, and they never showed their face. That was what scared me the most. Not knowing why, not knowing who, and knowing they could be out there still. I needed to get away. I'd been living in the city for years, and it was grinding me down. The noise, the people, the constant movement. Everything felt like it was closing in on me. I started to get headaches. My chest felt tight all the time. I wasn't sleeping right. I knew it wasn't healthy, but I didn't know how to fix it until a friend of mine told me about an old cabin up north his uncle owned. It was empty most of the year, and he said I could stay there as long as I needed. No rent, just to help keep it clean and report anything broken. It was deep in the woods, far away from the next house or road. Just a small wooden place with a metal roof, sitting at the end of a long dirt driveway that twisted through thick trees. The driveway itself was almost half a mile long, and from the cabin you couldn't see the road at all. Once you were there, you were really alone. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed up my truck with supplies, food, clothes, water, and some tools, and made the drive upstate. I arrived in the early evening. The sun was low, orange light slipping through the pines. The air was clean and quiet. I remember stepping out of the truck and just standing there, listening to the wind blow through the trees. No horns, no shouting, just the woods and me. I felt better already. The cabin was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a little kitchen with a gas range, a bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame, and a small bathroom with a compost toilet. No running water, just a few jugs that I'd have to refill at a spring nearby. It wasn't fancy, but I liked that. It was the kind of quiet that city people dream about but don't really understand until they feel it. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring a little at first. I unpacked, set up my sleeping bag, and spent the first night reading by lantern light. I fell asleep early. The air was cold, and the mattress was thin, but I slept hard. It had been a long time since I'd gone to bed without hearing a siren outside my window. The next morning, I walked the property. The forest was dense on all sides. I found a small fire pit out back, an old shed leaning to one side, and an axe buried in a stump with a pile of split logs next to it. I made coffee on the stove and sat outside on a folding chair I found inside the shed. The woods smelled like pine and earth. I could have stayed there for months. For a few days, everything was perfect. I read, wrote in a notebook, walked the woods, chopped wood, and cooked simple meals. I only had a weak phone signal if I walked a few minutes down the driveway, and I started leaving my phone off completely. I didn't miss anything. I felt more like myself than I had in years. But after a while, small things started to bother me. The first thing was a strange feeling I got whenever I stood at the front window, looking down the driveway. The way the trees lined it made it look like a dark tunnel, especially at dusk. Sometimes I would just stare down that long dirt path and get the feeling that something was watching me from the woods. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't scared exactly, but I felt uneasy. I shook it off, probably just my brain adjusting to the isolation. I'd spent years surrounded by millions of people, and now I was completely alone. Of course, things would feel weird at first. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard a sound outside. It was faint but sharp, like twigs breaking underfoot. I froze. I knew there were animals in the woods. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. But I couldn't tell what it was. It moved slowly, breaking branches one by one, circling around the cabin. I turned off the lantern and lay in the dark, listening. After a while, the sounds faded. The next morning, I checked outside. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks, no signs of anything walking around. Still, I kept the axe a little closer to the door that day, just in case. A few days passed. I settled back into a rhythm. But then one morning, I stepped out onto the porch and found something strange at the edge of the woods. It was just a small pile of stones stacked in a neat little tower. 5 or 6 stones, flat and balanced carefully on top of each other. I hadn't built it. I would have remembered, and it hadn't been there the day before. I was sure of that. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't look natural. It wasn't just a random pile. It was deliberate. I walked over and knocked it down, then stood there listening. Nothing. No movement. No sound. That afternoon, I sat out by the fire pit, trying to read, but I kept looking toward the woods. The trees felt closer than they had before, like they were crowding in around the cabin. It was just in my head, probably. I reminded myself I was here to clear my mind, to rest. But the next morning, the stone stack was back. Same place, same size. I hadn't heard a thing during the night. I left it alone that time. Then things got worse. One night, I was out by the fire after dark, wrapped in a blanket. I saw something at the far end of the driveway. A shape, a man. He was just standing there, right where the trees started to close in again. I couldn't see his face. He didn't move. He just stood there, far enough away that I couldn't make out details. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. I called out but got no answer, just silence. I stepped toward the cabin door, still watching him. I looked away for only a second, and when I looked back, he was gone. I locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the axe in my lap and the lantern on, listening to every creak and shift of the wood around me. The night dragged on forever. I wanted to believe it was just a hunter or a hiker, but that didn't make sense. Who would walk a half-mile down a private driveway into the middle of nowhere and just stand there? The next day, I walked to where he'd been. I looked for footprints but found none. The ground was soft, pine needles and dirt. There should have been something, but it was clean. I thought about leaving that day. I packed a few things, put them in the truck, and sat in the driver's seat for a while. But I didn't start the engine. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe I was seeing things. I was tired. That had to be it. That night, I kept the axe beside me in bed. 3 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the door handle moving. It was slow, soft. Someone was trying to turn it quietly. I sat up, holding my breath. My heart was pounding so loud I thought whoever was outside could hear it. I slipped out of bed and grabbed the axe. The handle jiggled again. Then it stopped. I waited. I didn't hear footsteps. No one walked away. I moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. I saw nothing, just black trees. I didn't sleep. I sat up until dawn, watching the door, the windows, everything. The next morning, I found footprints. Finally, they were faint but real. A single set coming up the steps and stopping at the door. They stood there for a while, then turned and walked back toward the woods. I followed them down the driveway, but they disappeared halfway to the road. I drove to town that day, bought more food, another padlock, and some nails. I boarded up the windows and put a second lock on the door. I kept the axe with me all the time now, even when I went to the shed or to get water. I started making noise when I walked, hitting the trees with a stick so animals or whatever else would know I was coming. But the feeling that someone was watching never left. I stopped walking the woods. I stayed close to the cabin. I kept a fire going every night. I even started sleeping in the day and staying up all night just watching. I didn't trust the dark anymore. One night, just before sunrise, I saw the man again. This time he was closer. He stood between two trees just a few yards past the fire pit. I could see his outline in the early light. He wasn't wearing anything bright, just dark clothes, and he didn't move. He never moved. I sat frozen, gripping the axe. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. Eventually, the sun came up fully, and when I looked back, he was gone. That was the last straw. I packed everything. I didn't even finish breakfast. I threw everything in the truck, slammed the door, and drove straight down the driveway without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I was shaking. My hands hurt from gripping the steering wheel so hard. I never went back. I told my friend to tell his uncle I was grateful, but that he needed to find someone else to watch the place. I didn't explain why. I didn't have the words. Weeks went by, then months. I started sleeping normally again, though it took time. I went back to the city, but something had changed. I didn't feel safe anymore, not even in my apartment. I started keeping the blinds shut. I got a camera for the front door. I checked it every night. A year later, I drove past that area just to see. I didn't go all the way to the cabin, but I stopped at a gas station near the road that led there. I asked the cashier if he knew the place, the one with the long driveway and the old metal roof cabin in the woods. He nodded and told me it had burned down a few months back. No one knew how. It was empty when it happened. No power, no gas leak, no... It was mid-October when I decided to take a break from everything. The city, the noise, the people, it all started to feel like too much. I had been working long hours at my job, barely sleeping, and I felt burnt out. A friend of mine had told me about a small cabin he used to visit during the fall, tucked deep into the woods in northern Minnesota, far from any main roads or towns. He said it was quiet, peaceful, and that I wouldn't see a single soul if I stayed there for a week. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin belonged to his uncle, but it hadn't been used in years. Still, he said it was livable. It had a wood stove, running water from a nearby stream through a gravity-fed system, a small solar panel for a light or two, and a basic bed. No cell service. No electricity apart from that small panel. No Wi-Fi. Just me and the forest. I agreed without thinking twice. I left the city early one morning, my car packed with food, water jugs, a sleeping bag, a portable gas stove, a few tools, and a bunch of books I'd been meaning to read. The drive took about 6 hours, with the last two being on rough gravel roads and eventually a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for my car. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, I was relieved. The place looked old but sturdy. The logs were weathered and dark. The tin roof had patches of rust, and the small porch creaked under my weight. The door was swollen from the weather and took some effort to push open. Inside, it smelled like dust, old wood, and earth. There was a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress, a shelf with some old canned food, a table, and a couple of chairs. I unpacked, checked that everything was working as it should, and settled in. The first couple of days were calm. I hiked around, gathered dry wood for the stove, read for hours, and cooked simple meals. I felt like my brain was finally slowing down. Each night, I would sit on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch in the forest. It was peaceful, but I couldn't help noticing how isolated it really was. There wasn't a single sound of civilization. Not a plane, not a car, not even a distant chainsaw. Just pure, deep silence. On the third night, things started to feel different. I had gone for a longer hike that day, deeper into the woods, using a marked trail I found behind the cabin. It looked like an old game trail, probably used by deer or other animals. I followed it for about an hour before turning back. I didn't see or hear anything strange, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a deer catching my scent. But that feeling stuck with me for the rest of the day. That night, I woke up suddenly. It was around 2 a.m., and I had that heavy feeling in my chest like something had startled me awake. I didn't hear anything at first, just the quiet crackle of the wood stove. But then I heard it, something crunching softly in the leaves outside. It didn't sound like wind. It was too rhythmic. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, like footsteps, but I didn't see anything through the small window next to the bed. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to see if I could find prints or any sign of what had been out there. The ground was covered in dead leaves, and I didn't find anything obvious, but I felt uneasy. I spent most of the day close to the cabin, chopping some wood and double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. I didn't want to scare myself more, but I also didn't want to ignore it. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were slower, almost deliberate. I had left a lantern burning on the porch, and its glow lit up a small circle outside. I stared at that circle, waiting for something to appear, but it never did. The sound stopped suddenly, and then everything was quiet again. I didn't know what to make of it. An animal? Maybe, but something didn't feel right. On the fifth day, I went back on the trail behind the cabin. I wanted to prove to myself that I was just being paranoid. I took a hatchet with me this time, just in case. About 15 minutes in, I found something odd. A pile of rocks stacked in a small pyramid, right in the middle of the trail. It didn't look natural. The rocks were too evenly placed, and there were fresh footprints around them. They weren't mine. I hadn't been down this trail since the third day, and these prints looked newer. I turned around and went straight back to the cabin. I locked the door and sat on the floor for a long time. I wasn't just nervous anymore, I was scared. Someone had been here. Someone had been walking around my cabin at night. I tried to calm down, telling myself it could have been a hunter or another hiker who found the trail. But the nearest town was miles away, and the trail didn't lead anywhere. It just looped through the forest. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lantern on, sat on the edge of the bed with the hatchet in my hand, and waited. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just walking. I heard the sound of something being dragged across the porch. It was slow, like wood against wood. Then, a soft thud, like something being placed right in front of the door. I froze. My mouth was dry. I couldn't move for a while. Eventually, I crept toward the door and looked out through the small gap in the wood. I couldn't see much, just the glow from the lantern and the dark forest beyond. But there was something sitting on the porch. I waited until sunrise before opening the door. There was a rabbit, dead. Its neck was broken, and it had been placed right on the mat outside the door. That was it for me. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things fast, barely ate, and loaded the car. But the path out wasn't easy to follow. The trail back to the main road was overgrown, and the dirt path that led to the cabin had new tire tracks on it, tracks that weren't mine. They were fresh. I drove slowly, heart racing the whole time, watching the woods around me. Every time I thought I saw something move, I'd stop the car and look, but there was never anything there. It took me 2 hours to reach the gravel road, and I didn't stop until I got to a gas station in a small town. I told the guy behind the counter where I had been staying. He looked at me and shook his head. He said the land around there used to belong to a group of survivalists who disappeared back in the 90s. Some people thought a few of them were still out there, living off-grid, watching anyone who got too close. I never went back to that cabin. I never even spoke to my friend about it again. I just told him I left early because of the cold. But that week stayed with me. Now, every fall, when the leaves change and the air gets crisp, I think about that cabin. I think about those nights, about the footsteps, about that dead rabbit. Someone was out there, watching me, maybe testing me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'm glad I left when I did. I still love the woods. I still go hiking, but I never go alone anymore. And I never stay overnight somewhere that far out again. Some places feel quiet for a reason, not because no one's there, but because someone is and they don't want to be found. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything and drive up to a remote cabin in northern Michigan. I had found it online, some old listing on a forum where people posted about rustic, off-the-grid places to stay. The guy who rented it out only asked for a small deposit through the mail and gave me a handwritten map with directions. There was no address, just landmarks and trails to follow once I turned off the main highway. That should have been a red flag, but I wanted to be away from people, noise, stress, everything. I was tired, burned out. I just wanted silence. The drive was long and boring. As I passed the last town, the road started turning into gravel, then into a dirt track full of dips and rocks. It was the kind of path that looked like it hadn't been driven on in months. I followed the directions carefully, turning at a broken fence, crossing a shallow stream, and climbing a steep hill with loose stones that made my tires slip more than once. Finally, after nearly 5 hours of driving, I reached the cabin. It was a single-story structure, made of old wood that looked gray and dry. The roof sagged a little on one side, and there was moss growing on the back wall. It didn't look welcoming, but it stood on a high patch of land that overlooked a deep valley surrounded by trees. There were no signs of anyone nearby, no cabins in the distance, no cars, no signs of logging, just endless forest. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room with a small bed, a table, 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, and some shelves with canned food, candles, matches, and old tools. The windows were covered with thick curtains. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just a big water container with a pump outside and an outhouse behind the cabin. I unpacked my things and lit a fire in the stove. I had brought some dry food, water, and a small generator just in case, but I decided not to use it. I wanted to keep things simple. That night, I sat by the fire, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional crackle of the wood. It was peaceful, too quiet maybe. I didn't realize how much background noise filled my daily life until it was completely gone. The first 2 days were fine. I slept well, ate simple meals, and spent hours just walking in the woods around the cabin. I didn't see any animals, not even birds, which felt strange. I kept looking up into the trees, expecting to see squirrels or hear the flapping of wings, but there was nothing. The forest felt empty. On the 3rd day, I woke up early to a strange sound. It was faint but constant, like something brushing against wood. I sat up in bed and listened. The sound stopped. I thought maybe it was a branch against the cabin wall, but when I went outside, everything was still. There was no wind. I walked around the cabin, checking the walls, but nothing looked out of place. I figured it was nothing and went on with my day. That afternoon, I hiked farther than I had before. I followed a small trail downhill, past a dry creek bed and through some dense undergrowth. After about an hour, I saw something in the distance. An old hunting stand or watchtower, partly hidden by the trees. I walked up to it. The ladder was broken, and the platform was sagging. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Around it, the ground was covered with dead leaves, but I noticed something odd. In a small circle beneath the platform, the ground was bare, as if something had been sitting there recently. That night, I heard the sound again. This time, it was louder. It wasn't coming from the wall. It was above me, on the roof. Something was moving slowly across the cabin roof, like it was crawling. I stayed frozen in bed, listening. The sound continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. I waited another half hour before getting up and checking outside. There was nothing on the roof, no fallen branches, no signs of animal tracks in the dirt. Still, I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I noticed something strange. One of the cans from the shelf had fallen on the floor. I hadn't touched it. I had kept everything neat. It was a can of beans, rolled into the middle of the room. I picked it up, put it back, and tried to ignore the uneasiness building in my stomach. That day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, reading a book I'd brought, listening to the fire. I kept glancing at the door and windows. Every little creak made me jump. The silence felt heavy. In the afternoon, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I stood still, my heart thudding in my chest. The steps stopped right in front of the door. I waited. Nothing. No knock. No sound. Just silence. I didn't move until it was dark. When I finally opened the door, there was no one. But there were footprints on the porch. Bare footprints. Human. They led up to the door and stopped. There were no prints going back down the steps. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the stove with the axe I found under the bed. I kept the fire going and listened to every sound. Around midnight, I heard movement again, on the roof, then near the back wall. It was careful, slow. I thought about turning on the generator and using the spotlight I'd brought, but something in me said not to. I just waited. In the morning, I found the water container outside had been tipped over. It was heavy, at least 50 gallons. The lid was off and the pump was broken. It looked like it had been twisted until it snapped. That was the last straw. I packed my things, shoved everything into the car, and drove out. I didn't care about the deposit. I just wanted to leave. As I drove down the dirt path, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone. But when I got to the stream, the one I had crossed when coming in, I saw something. A figure standing at the tree line, far back, barely visible. It wasn't moving, just watching. I didn't stop. It took hours to get back to the main road. I didn't stop until I was 2 towns away. I found a motel and stayed there for the night. I barely slept. The next morning, I checked my car. On the back window, drawn in the dirt, was a handprint. A bare hand, larger than mine, smeared into the dust. I washed it off and drove home. I never reported anything. I didn't contact the guy who rented the cabin. I never went back. Sometimes I still think about it, what could have been out there, why the forest was so quiet, who or what left those footprints. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. I know that. It was real. Something or someone was watching me that whole time, and they didn't want me there. I don't go into the woods anymore.